Chapter 252. Lu Chen was startled and frowned. Back then, on the night of the full moon, when Mount Kunlun changed, he did not know that something had happened to Hakushin Jinkuin. However, when he saw the great changes in the sky and the collapse of Winter Peak, Lu Chen actually had some premonition, but he had not confirmed it. These days, he had been chased by both the righteous and evil sections. He had been on the run all the way to the land of chaos and did not have a chance to inquire about this news. When he arrived at the land of chaos, firstly, it was vast and sparsely populated. Secondly, he deliberately avoided crowds and went to remote and dangerous places, so he really did not have a chance to ask about this matter. He did not expect to hear this news from White Lotus today. No matter what, White Lotus's master was not an ordinary person. He was a divine transformation stage perfected lord who stood at the peak of the human race's martial strength. There were less than 10 of them in the entire world. Every divine transformation stage perfected lord could be said to be a famous authority in the world. Even the slightest movement would attract attention from everywhere, let alone their death. Hakushin Jinkuin's death was undoubtedly a great blow to the strength of the Kunlun party. However, there was a silver lining in the misfortune. The Kunlun party was, after all, a 1,000-year-old sect with a deep foundation. Other than the deceased Hakushin Jinkuin, there was still perfected Lord Tianlan. Otherwise, the death of a perfected lord could directly reduce the strength of a large sect by a level. In addition, there were some differences between the two perfected lords of the Kunlun party. Hakushin Jinkuin had been famous for a long time and was now very old. Even at the level of a perfected lord, he could be considered to have one foot in the grave. On the contrary, his junior brother perfected Lord Tianlan could be considered to be in the prime of his life. Whether it was his body, cultivation, knowledge, temperament, reputation, or so on, he was almost at the peak of his prime. This was also the reason why, although Hakushin Jinkuin had died, the foundation of the Kunlun party was not damaged. These thoughts flashed across his mind, but Lu Chen did not show it on his face. He only said to White Lotus, "Your master Hakushin Jinkuin has passed away? This is a huge matter. Why didn't you stay on the mountain of Kunlun to observe your filial piety? Why did you come to the wilderness of the disorienting lands?" White Lotus pursed her lips. There was a hint of ridicule on her face, but it wasn't directed at Lu Chen. She casually waved her hand and said, "If he died, then he died. If he really had a filial heart, Master wouldn't care if I kowtowed a few times in front of his coffin. More importantly, if I return to Kunlun Mountain after his death, it's hard to say what will happen to me." Lu Chen's face darkened. He looked at White Lotus and pondered for a moment. Slowly, the light in his eyes gradually brightened. That night, although Lu Chen was also on the mountain of Kunlun Mountain, he had brushed past the soul-stirring incident of the Kunlun party. He was like an outsider. At this moment, when he heard White Lotus's words, he seemed to have thought of something. "You seem to suspect the people of the Kunlun party?" Lu Chen asked White Lotus. White Lotus snorted and said, "I'm not an idiot. After the two of us parted that night, I walked towards the Winter Peak for a while. Even before I reached there, I felt that something was wrong. Then, one after another, I secretly heard that Master died in battle and eldest martial brother was seriously injured and went into closed-door meditation. It would be a joke to say that there's nothing wrong here." Lu Chen nodded slowly. There was a bit of appreciation in his eyes as he looked at this little girl. However, he still couldn't help but say, "Since you feel that something is wrong and don't want to stay on the mountain of Kunlun Mountain, you should go back to your hometown, the Bai clan in Kunwa City. There are always your elders and family members there who can take care of you." White Lotus had a disapproving look on her face and even had a trace of contempt. She said, "If someone in the Kunlun party really wants to harm me, you wouldn't think that the Bai clan can handle it, right?" Lu Chen smiled and said, "That's true. The Bai clan definitely can't handle someone who can arm wrestle with your master and senior martial brother." White Lotus said, "Not only can't they handle it, but there are also no good people in that clan. If someone really forces them too much, maybe that family will turn around and send me there to take credit. I won't go to the Bai clan unless my brain is damaged." Lu Chen looked at her with interest. He only felt that this excessively beautiful little girl seemed to be more and more mysterious and suspicious. He said with a smile, "That's your hometown. Well, from what you see, you also have a lot of dissatisfaction with the Bai clan." White Lotus was about to open her mouth and seemed to want to complain for a while, but she suddenly became alert. She glanced at Lu Chen and coldly snorted, "It's none of your business." Lu Chen laughed and said, "Hey little girl, don't be so vulgar." White Lotus ignored him and walked straight to Atsu's side. She reached out her hand to touch its head. Today, Atsu was a huge black wolf. Just by standing, it seemed to be taller than White Lotus. But White Lotus didn't look afraid at all. Instead, she was interested in touching the smooth fur on Atsu's head. Atsu's expression was also very strange. He seemed to want to leave, but he also seemed to feel comfortable. He hesitated, but in the end he still stood there without moving. He probably felt that this mysterious and fierce little girl did not have any hostility towards him. In Kunlun Mountain, the relationship between Lu Chen and White Lotus had always been very subtle. On the surface, they maintained a peaceful relationship. But in private, they had fought to the death several times. Their actions were also extremely ruthless. It was not an exaggeration to say that they were mortal enemies. But now, in the chaotic land far away from Kunlun Mountain, in this dangerous, vast, and sparsely populated wilderness, the atmosphere between the two of them seemed to be a lot more peaceful. At most, they just quarreled a little, but they didn't have the intention to fight anymore. But even so, when Lu Chen was about to leave with Atsu, he saw White Lotus following him calmly as if nothing had happened. He couldn't help but roll his eyes and said, "I say, why do you keep following me?" White Lotus said matter-of-factly, "Tell me the secret of the blood food secret method, and I won't pester you." Lu Chen sneered and said, "You're just a little girl, but not only do you know the blood food secret method, you also know so many sinister methods and magical powers. Why don't you tell me the origin of these secrets first?" White Lotus shook her head and said, "I can't tell you." Lu Chen said, "Then why should I tell you? Besides, this method is originally a plaything of the southern barbarians. It's incompatible with our Central Earth's Tao method and magical powers. Even if you don't know about it, it doesn't matter. Why do you care so much about it?" White Lotus wanted to say something but hesitated. She glanced at Lu Chen and shook her head. "Why do you always have a belly full of evil tricks? Why do you always try to get information from a little girl like me?" Lu Chen laughed and turned around to walk away. He said, "If you don't want to tell me, I can't force you. But this chaotic land is full of unfathomable dangers. If we go deeper, even I don't dare to be careless. My life could be in danger at any time. Although you have some skills, you're still a child. You also have a clan in Kunwa City. Why do you need to run here and suffer? If you die here without rhyme or reason, wouldn't it be too unjust?" White Lotus thought for a moment but still followed him. She then calmly said, "I don't have anyone close to me in my clan. Since I was a child, no one has taken a liking to me. It's just that their temperament suddenly changed after they found out I have the 5-pillar divine disc. It's annoying. In any case, it's rare for me to come out. This carefree life is much more comfortable than living in Kunlun." Lu Chen smiled and said, "Then why don't you go by yourself? Wouldn't that be more carefree? The world is so big. You can go anywhere and do whatever you want to do." White Lotus shook her head. After a pause, she said in a slightly gloomy voice, "After coming out, it seems like you're the only person I know in the whole world. In any case, I have nothing to do. I'll just follow you for a while." Lu Chen was startled. For a moment he didn't know what to say. The words he wanted to say suddenly couldn't come out. He was silent for a moment. Then he suddenly laughed at himself. He thought to himself that he was indeed much more soft-hearted than the cold and emotionless assassin from 10 years ago. His mood suddenly became somewhat gloomy. However, he felt a little closer to White Lotus. Perhaps it was the loneliness of youth that reminded him of his painful childhood. So he slowly walked forward, no longer chasing White Lotus away. At the same time, he casually asked, "Don't you have any close relatives in your family? What about your parents?" White Lotus said, "They died before I was born." Lu Chen laughed in spite of himself. If they died before you were born, then there wouldn't be you. White Lotus was startled for a moment. Then she also laughed. Perhaps she also felt that what she said was a little silly. Or perhaps her relationship with her parents was too shallow. So, she shrugged her shoulders and said, I'm wrong. They died before I became sensible. That's why I don't remember what they look like. Do you miss them? Lu Chen pushed away a branch in front of him. He took 2 steps forward. However, he only saw a complex terrain of intersecting mountains and valleys. At the same time, there was a very gloomy and dense forest in front of him. Most of the trees in this forest were dark brown. The trunks were tall and the crowns were luxuriant. However, the strange thing was that there were vines of various sizes hanging everywhere in the forest. Most of them were hanging on the branches of different heights. Many of them were growing on the ground of the forest. But other than that, there wasn't much abnormality. Lu Chen stared at the forest, and his brows suddenly furrowed. At this time, White Lotus also walked to his side and said, I don't miss them. Lu Chen was slightly surprised. He looked at her and said, Why? People have feelings for their children. It's natural. No matter what, it's your parents who gave birth to you. Why don't you miss them? White Lotus snorted and said, Since they gave birth to me, shouldn't they raise me and take care of me? They didn't have the ability and died early, leaving me to suffer alone. Why should I remember their kindness? Lu Chen thought for a moment and said, Perhaps they also have their difficulties? White Lotus didn't seem to want to talk about this topic anymore. She walked straight forward and said, What difficulties does a dead person have? Chapter 253. Okay. Lu Chen seemed to have finally admitted defeat and gave up the idea of driving White Lotus away. If you want to follow me, then follow me. But I have to say something first. If you encounter any danger, such as a killer suddenly jumping out from the side to attack you, you're on your own. White Lotus stopped and glanced at him. She sneered and said, Who are you trying to scare? Let me tell you Before he could finish his sentence, he suddenly heard a sharp whistling sound. Several figures suddenly rushed out from the nearby forest. They were all dressed in black and held sharp blades in their hands. The sharp blades reflected a cold light that made people tremble with fear. Without saying a word, they directly slashed at him. The attack was extremely fierce. More than half of the attack was aimed at Lu Chen, while the rest was aimed at White Lotus and Atsu. Bai Lian jumped in fright. She tapped the ground with the tip of her foot and quickly retreated. At the same time, she shrieked, I have nothing to do with him. Before she could finish speaking, the blades were already right in front of her. It was obvious that these black-clothed men were determined to kill everyone here no matter what. White Lotus was so angry that her eyes were on fire, but she could do nothing. After cursing, she suddenly lowered her head and floated back a few feet. At the same time, she waved her hand. In an instant, the surrounding air quickly cooled down. Some frost and snow drifted through her fingertips. Some of the green branches and leaves closest to her actually turned white. As if affected by the sudden cold current, the black-clothed man who was rushing over slowed down for a moment. However, that person seemed to be experienced. He snorted coldly behind the black cloth and shook his arms slightly. In an instant, the icicles and snowflakes that appeared on the blade scattered in all directions and scattered all over the sky. However, the sharp and cold blade still ruthlessly chopped down. It looked like this incomparably beautiful little girl was about to be chopped into two with a single stroke. White Lotus's eyes shone brightly. In an instant, there seemed to be wind and snow drifting through her pupils. Her clothes fluttered even though there was no wind. A cold current flowed out from her body. On the other side, Lu Chen, who had also been surrounded by several black-clothed men, glanced at White Lotus. There was a little surprise in his eyes. He whispered to himself, Ice Snow Scripture? As expected of a five-pillar genius. This talent is really amazing. There were quite a few more black-robed men surrounding him compared to Bai Lian's group. They were all glaring at Lu Chen like they were about to spit fire. Their hatred was immeasurable, as if every single one of them wanted nothing more than to tear him to shreds. No matter who it was, It was not a comfortable thing to be stared at by so many people with such crazy and hateful gazes. Everyone would feel fear and disgust. However, at this moment, Lu Chen's expression was still expressionless. There was no sadness or joy. It was as if he was an emotionless stone person. This kind of indifferent attitude, in turn, stimulated the black-clothed men around him. In the midst of the angry curses, who knew how many soul-chasing blades of light slashed over? Lu Chen's footsteps were nimble and elegant like the wind. He avoided the attacks of the three people in front of him, but when he retreated, he forgot that there was still someone behind him. The black-clothed man was shocked at first, then delighted. He stabbed forward with his blade, but just as he raised his arm, a huge shadow fell from the sky. It covered his eyes and instantly threw him to the ground. The smell of blood instantly spread. The terrifying and fierce giant wolf suddenly raised its head. Its front legs were still pressing down on the black-clothed man who was struggling desperately on the ground. Dark red blood flowed from its huge mouth. There was a big hole in the black-clothed man's neck. Blood was gushing out. It seemed that it was difficult for him to survive. The surrounding black-clothed men were taken aback. But for these killers who came from the evil cult, it was obvious that this little bit of blood was not enough to scare them away. After a moment, several black-clothed men came together again. This time, even Atsu was surrounded. "Traitor, die!" A shout that seemed to contain a trace of madness rang out from the black-clothed people's mouths. Lu Chen's face was gloomy as he coldly looked at these vicious and valiant killers who were like lunatics. Once upon a time, he was also one of them. Lu Chen's eyes had begun to ignite with black flames. He then walked towards them. The sword swallowed and spat, the black flames crisscrossed. This battle at the edge of the black forest lasted for about half an hour. The final result was that the black-clothed men left behind a few corpses. The rest of them retreated. Lu Chen's side was not good either. There were 3 more wounds on his body. Blood was flowing. Even the wounds that were almost healed a few days ago were either broken again or were scratched with new wounds. In contrast, although White Lotus's situation looked a little embarrassing, it was better than Lu Chen's. At least she was not seriously injured. Her face was a little pale. She stood in the same place and gasped for breath. It seemed that she had exhausted all her strength. That was the manifestation of a large amount of spiritual power consumption. Compared to these two people, Black Wolf Atsu was obviously better. There was almost no injury on its body. Not even a knife wound could be seen. Probably those black-clothed men focused on Lu Chen and White Lotus, so they did not have time to greet it. After the battle, Lu Chen sat tiredly on a tree stump that had been cut by one of the black-clothed men just now. This time, the black-clothed men's cultivation was not low and their combat power was high. It was just that they did not quite understand Lu Chen's strange black flame technique. They suffered a lot in the battle just now. However, Lu Chen felt that if he waited until the next assassination, the power of the black flame would probably be reduced. "Hey, why are you like this?" There was an angry complaint from the front. Needless to say, it was White Lotus. Her beautiful and moving little face was full of anger as she said, "A bunch of people randomly jump out from the side to kill you. You're like a madman. You even implicated me." Even though Lu Chen was exhausted, he still laughed loudly when he heard this and said, "Didn't I tell you just now? Don't regret it if you follow me. But seeing that we've both stayed on the Kunlun Mountains, I'll give you a word of advice. These people are all madmen. They have no qualms about killing people. Otherwise, you'd better leave me. At least you can live a little longer." White Lotus snorted. Her expression was a little strange. After looking at Lu Chen for a while, she suddenly said, "You really are a jinx." Lu Chen said, "Everything is fine. Why are you scolding people?" White Lotus said, "If not, why did you implicate Yexin to die?" Lu Chen's body shook. The smile on his face slowly disappeared. He seemed to have something to say. But in the end he remained silent. After a bitter laugh, he shook his head and did not speak again. After being suddenly stabbed by White Lotus's cold words, Lu Chen became much quieter. He did not say a word for a long time. As a result, the atmosphere between the two people and the wolf suddenly became stiff. However, Atsu did not seem to care. It was still sniffing around. It seemed that it was not at ease with its surroundings. Lu Chen whistled, and Atu ran to his side. Lu Chen gestured for it to squat down, and then he climbed onto it. Then he rode on the black wolf and began to move forward. White Lotus's eyes instantly lit up. The way she looked at Atsu suddenly changed. After a while, she ran over and said loudly, "I want to sit too. Let me sit too." Atsu growled. It seemed to be unwilling. Lu Chen also waved his hand and said, "Go, go, go. I was injured. In order to recover as soon as possible, I let Atsu carry me temporarily. How are you injured? Why are you joining in the fun? Go away." White Lotus said indignantly, "Hey! Don't turn your back on me so quickly. At least I helped you to stop two men in black just now, okay? Besides, if it wasn't for my skills and the magical power of ice and snow that my dead master taught me, wouldn't I be dead now? How could I help you win this battle? It's already like this, and you still won't let me ride this black dog wolf?" Lu Chen smiled and said, "Atsu has its own intelligence. It has its own decision in its heart." After saying that, he lowered his head and patted Atsu's head. He said, "Atsu, are you going to let her come up?" As he said that, he pointed at White Lotus. Atsu looked at the direction he was pointing at. It barked twice and then shook its head like a child playing with a rattle drum. White Lotus was very angry, but there was nothing she could do. She could only scold this stupid dog, "No, Black Wolf," and then followed the two of them forward. Along the way, Lu Chen would pat Atsu's head from time to time, indicating the direction it should go. Unconsciously or unconsciously, he avoided the strange dark brown forest. At the same time, not far away from him, because Lu Chen was riding the wolf and White Lotus was walking, her body looked even smaller. But White Lotus did not have much opinion on this. She seemed to have calmed down from her initial anger. She said to Lu Chen, "I have something to ask you." Lu Chen declined to comment and said, "Say it." White Lotus said, "Why did you suddenly sense the pursuers so keenly?" She stared at him and said, "This is not quite right. You always seem to know something about the evil sect in advance." Lu Chen shook his head and said, "You misunderstood. The reason why I know a little about the evil sect is actually because I once stayed in the evil sect for a period of time." White Lotus thought for a moment and said, "If that's the case, no wonder those evil sect people shouted at you like a traitor." Lu Chen smiled bitterly and did not want to continue this topic. At the same time, he also turned around and stared at the road he came from. His face showed a trace of doubt. Previously, he had purposely chosen this inaccessible path. He had even risked encountering the savage and terrifying barbarian tribes in the Land of Chaos in order to avoid being hunted down by both the righteous and Devil Dao. But why, after so many days, those evil sect killers still seemed to be able to clearly find his whereabouts? This matter made people feel that there was something strange about it. Chapter 254. "There's something I must ask you." Lu Chen suddenly stopped and said to White Lotus, "If you don't make it clear, we can't stay together." White Lotus glanced at him and said, "You look like you're interrogating a criminal. What is it? Although I have fought with you a few times, but until now I have not really let you down. I am just a little girl, you are a man, what are you afraid of? I really don't understand." Saying that, she shook her head repeatedly, looking as if she did not agree. Lu Chen was not moved at all. He did not pay attention to her changing the topic, only stared at her and said, "On the night of the full moon, why did you go to that forest?" White Lotus snorted and said, "I was bored, so I went to play. Why? Can't I?" Lu Chen indifferently said, "There was such a heavy storm, why did you go to that dark forest to play?" White Lotus's mouth twitched, but she turned her head and said, "None of your business." Lu Chen did not ask further, turned and walked away, said, "It doesn't matter if I don't care, but you don't need to follow." White Lotus looked back and saw Lu Chen and Atsu had really left on their own, neat and tidy, without the slightest bit of sloppiness. She could not help but be angered. Her figure flashed and floated in front of them, stretched out her hand to block Lu Chen's way, angrily said, "I just want to follow you. What do you want? How can you be so petty? At least when the evil faction tried to assassinate you, I helped you to hold back a few killers. Why are you so quick to turn your back on me? If you didn't help me in front of the evil faction killers, I wouldn't even ask you these questions. Lu Chen shook his head and said, It's not that I'm petty, it's that the identity of the people who went to that forest that night is not a small matter. I must find out. If you don't tell me, then I can't go with you. If you insist on following me, then I can only fight with you, and then both of us will be injured and go our separate ways. That's it. White Lotus was stunned for a moment. She still didn't quite understand, but she saw that Lu Chen's expression was unusually firm. He didn't seem to be joking, nor did he show any signs of relenting. The expression on her face fluctuated. After a while, she said, All right, I'm here to look for you. Lu Chen's gaze suddenly turned cold as he looked at White Lotus and said coldly, You are from the Three Realms Demon Sect? What? Of course not. White Lotus cried out, looking angry and aggrieved. No matter what, I'm a five-pillar genius who was accepted by a soul formation perfected lord, all right? I'm not a fool to join a fiend cult for no reason. Lu Chen stared at her for a moment. Then he slowly nodded. His expression softened a little. What you said makes sense. Then he seemed to have thought of something. He suddenly smiled bitterly and said in a low voice, But to be honest, there are actually those kinds of fools. What? White Lotus didn't hear clearly and asked, Oh, nothing. Lu Chen waved his hand. Then he sternly asked, Why did you look for me that night? Also, how did you know that I was in that forest and find me? Speaking up to here, Lu Chen's expression turned serious. These days, he had been repeatedly recalling the process of that full moon night. Other than perfected Lord Tianlan going back on his words and not going outside, what surprised and puzzled him the most was the sudden appearance of White Lotus. This little girl seemed to be filled with countless secrets, making it hard for people to see her true face. White Lotus looked a little reluctant. It seemed that she didn't want to say it, but under Lu Chen's determined gaze, she finally shrugged and said, I can feel your position. Lu Chen's body shook. A trace of astonishment flashed across his face. He said, My position? Are you sure? Haven't you always been interested in Atu? I had already believed that you were probably able to sense the location of this stupid dog because of the secret of blood feeding, this kind of messy southern barbarian sorcery. What? Atu roared from the side and bared his teeth. His expression was ferocious as he looked at White Lotus with an unfriendly gaze. White Lotus was angry. She spat at the guy who looked like a giant wolf and scolded, It's Lu Chen who scolded you. What are you yelling at me for? Are you bullying the weak and afraid of the strong? Atsu wagged its tail and leaned against Lu Chen. It seemed to be saying, Don't try to drive a wedge between us, woman. White Lotus shook her head. She was too lazy to care about the strange black dog. She said to Lu Chen seriously, Now that things have come to this, it seems that I can only tell you the truth. In fact, what I can feel is not this stupid dog, but your position. You have the breath of the branch of the tree of God on you, and it always resonates with my pendant. As she said, she reached into her chest and turned over her clothes. She took out a pendant. It was the branch of the tree of God that Lu Chen had seen that day. Lu Chen's expression changed slightly. After White Lotus said those words, she kept staring at Lu Chen's expression. At the same time, she stared at him, waiting for him to speak. Unexpectedly, Lu Chen just frowned and did not speak for a long time. She could not see anything and felt a little unhappy. He said, This branch of the tree of God is definitely a rare treasure in this world. It's one of a kind, so I want to know why you have the breath of the branch of the tree of God on you. Lu Chen was speechless. At this time, he of course understood. As for why he had the breath of the branch of the tree of God on him, the answer was also obvious. It was naturally the mysterious tree hole that accidentally brought the unconscious White Lotus into the seed. As a result, the ancient tree hole absorbed abundant spiritual power from the branch of the tree of God and changed. The most obvious and most mysterious change was that, on the tree wall that was covered by the green mist in the tree hole, the shape of two doorways appeared. The tree of God was a holy object that was worshipped and revered by the Three Realms divine sect. When Lu Chen first sneaked into the devil sect, he did not really believe in this thing. However, later on, he found out that the legendary one branch, two leaves, one seed really existed. Moreover, by chance, he also secretly obtained the most important seed. The seed of the tree of God and the branch of the tree of God came from the same source. If something magical happened between the two of them, it would not be too strange. However, from then on, White Lotus could suddenly feel his own position. This was a very troublesome thing. While he was calculating, White Lotus asked, "I've been thinking about it for a long time. I didn't feel anything like this when I first saw you. It was only after I fainted that you started to have this aura." Lu Chen's heart skipped a beat. He could not help but look at White Lotus. He thought to himself, this little girl looks young, but her mind is really exquisite, crystal clear, and extremely smart. It is as if she has a telepathic connection with me and thought of the same thing at once. White Lotus looked at Lu Chen and snorted coldly. "Did you do something when I was unconscious? That's why the power of the branch of the tree of God was a little difficult to control after I woke up." "There's no such thing." Lu Chen shook his head very straightforwardly and lied to the girl without blushing. Then he said, "Could it be that you found something wrong with the branch of the tree of God?" White Lotus gritted her teeth and looked a little distressed. "That's the problem. The treasure itself didn't seem to have any problems. But why did you suddenly have this kind of breath?" Lu Chen relaxed and laughed. "Maybe it's because you used the power of the tree of God to attack me that day. After I was injured, I got a little smell. You can't blame me for this." White Lotus looked doubtful and looked at Lu Chen suspiciously. She probably felt that this man's words couldn't be completely trusted. But at the moment, she couldn't say anything. After all, there was nothing wrong with the branch of the tree of God. Lu Chen put down the stone in his heart and felt much more relaxed. He turned around and continued to walk forward. At the same time, he said to White Lotus, "Then according to what you said, you were able to find me in this disorienting lands because of the breath of the branch of the tree of God?" White Lotus said, "Yes. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been able to catch up to you. You're as cunning as a loach. If I were someone else, I probably wouldn't have been able to catch up to you." Lu Chen chuckled. His face was expressionless, but at the same time, he snorted in his heart. That's right. Logically speaking, he should have shaken off his pursuers. Why were they able to catch up to him? Several of our hall's most powerful experts who specialize in tracking have already entered the disorienting lands. No matter how He Lang tries to evade, he shouldn't be able to escape from their pursuit. At the foot of Kunlun Mountain, in Kunwa City, inside the Black Hill Pavilion in a secluded alley, Old Ma expressionlessly leaned against the wall of the hand-wrapping corridor. He looked at the two people in the courtyard. One was a bald fatty with an unusually tall and sturdy figure. Even though he was just sitting, he seemed taller than the charming and beautiful woman standing in front of him. When Old Ma's gaze fell on the woman again, there was a trace of deeply concealed fear in his eyes. She was Xue Ying, the leader of Zhengxianmeng Fuyunji. She had been in this position for 10 years. Once, he and Lu Chen could be considered as people who lived under her protection and lived in seclusion to avoid calamity. At this moment, when she said these words to true Lord Tunlun, her expression was calm. It was as if she was talking about an ordinary matter that had nothing to do with her. There was no joy or anger on true Lord Tianlon's face. There was only calmness. After a while, true Lord Tunlun suddenly shook his head and said, "Not necessarily." Xue Ying was a little surprised. She raised her head and looked at true Lord Tunlun. She frowned and said, "But isn't He Lang almost a cripple?" True Lord Tianlon closed his eyes and didn't say anything. Xue Ying waited for a while and didn't dwell on this issue. She said, "I came here this time to ask you to tell me how we should treat He Lang in the future." At this moment, Old Ma, who was standing to the side, unconsciously straightened his body. His gaze also quietly fell on true Lord Tianlon's face. There was a moment of silence in the courtyard. Xue Ying slowly asked word by word, "Should we release him or kill him?" Chapter 255. Should he be let go, or should he be killed? Xue Ying spoke very slowly. Although her expression was still calm, there was a hint of seriousness in her eyes as she stared unblinkingly at true Lord Tianlon. Old Ma, who was in the corridor, seemed to be holding his breath as he looked nervously at the fatty sitting in the courtyard. True Lord Tianlong was silent for a while, then said lightly, "Don't worry about him, let him be." Shui Ying nodded and agreed. Old Ma, who was beside her, let out a long sigh and wiped his forehead with his hand. True Lord Tianlan's gaze seemed to inadvertently sweep over the corridor, but it quickly moved away. He looked at Shui Ying and said, "Mobilize the people from the disorienting lands and send them back to the Immortal City in several batches. You also go back there to oversee things and prepare carefully. In about half a year to a year, I will send out the Heaven token." Shui Ying had been very calm all along. Even when it came to dealing with Hei Lang, she did not show any change in her expression. However, when she suddenly heard the words Heaven token, her body shook violently. She could not help but ask True Lord Tianlong, "My lord, are you talking about the Heaven's token?" True Lord Tianlong nodded and did not say anything. Shui Ying lowered her head, as if she knew that she had lost her composure. However, after taking a deep breath, her expression had already calmed down. There was even a hint of excitement in her eyes. True Lord Tianlong saw the change in Shui Ying's expression but did not say anything. After a while, Shui Ying asked carefully, "My lord, about the reorganization of Fuyunji that you mentioned before, let's begin." True Lord Tianlong did not hesitate and said straightforwardly, "Just do as I told you before. The Immortal City has basically been arranged, you just need to follow the plan. I still need to reorganize the Kunlun party for a while, but it should not take too long. When the time comes, I will come and tell you." "My lord is wise." Shui Ying bowed deeply. At this moment, the face of this charming and beautiful woman did not seem to have the usual fierceness. Instead, there was a bit of heartfelt admiration. However, perfected Lord Tianlong was probably the only person in this world who could make a woman like her have such an expression. After a while, when all that needed to be said was said, Shui Ying bade farewell and left. Supreme Lord Tianlong naturally sat there without moving. It was old Ma who sent Shui Ying out of the deserted Black Hill Pavilion. Just as she was about to step out of the door, Shui Ying suddenly stopped and turned to look at old Ma. Shui Ying's expression was different from her previous humble and obedient demeanor in front of true Lord Tianlong in the courtyard. At this moment, Shui Ying's expression had returned to her usual self. The sharpness hidden in her beautiful face seemed to be released once again as she looked indifferently at old Ma. Old Ma stepped aside and quietly lowered his head. "Old Ma," Blood Oriole called out. "I'm here," replied old Ma. "How long have you been with Hei Lang?" Old Ma hesitated for a moment, but still answered honestly, "More than 10 years. If we count from the time when he was still in the devil cult, then even earlier." Shui Ying hummed and said, "You are also an old person in Fuyunji. Moreover, Hei Lang's identity is special. Back then, even I could not ask about him. Only you and Supreme could contact him. What do you think of this person?" Old Ma was silent for a moment, then said, "It doesn't matter what I think. The most important thing is what Supreme and you plan to do. As long as there is an order, we, as subordinates, will naturally follow it." Shui Ying stared at him for a moment, then nodded and left without saying anything else. After watching the charming yet vaguely fierce woman leave, old Ma stood alone for a while before returning to the backyard. Supreme Tianlong was still sitting in the same place. At this moment he was looking up at the sky. Old Ma walked to his side and stood there. He also looked up and saw a dark cloud floating in the small sky above his head. "Do you blame me?" Supreme Lord Tianlong suddenly asked. Old Ma shook his head and said, "No, it was Hei Lang who couldn't get over it and insisted on walking down the road of no return. It's not your fault." Supreme Tianlong snorted and shook his head without saying anything. Old Ma continued, "That night, on the long street of Kunwu City, I already told him everything that should be said. Hei Lang himself should know how serious the consequences of his actions were and how troublesome it would be." Supreme Tianlong was silent for a long time before he said, "After staying in the devil cult for a long time, his temperament has probably changed." Old Ma's body trembled slightly and he subconsciously blurted out, "But he's absolutely respectful and loyal to you." Supreme Tianlong turned to look at old Ma. That gaze was calm and emotionless, but it seemed as heavy as a mountain. At that moment, Old Ma felt as if the entire Kunlun mountain was pressing down on his shoulders and back, making him feel suffocated. He almost knelt down. Fortunately, this feeling disappeared in the blink of an eye. In the end, he clenched his teeth and endured it. But after a while, the back of his clothes was already wet. After a while, Supreme Tunlan seemed to be a little dispirited and said, "Forget it. Anyway, it's already like this. Let him be. I don't know if he really came back from the land of chaos alive." Shui Ying went all the way out of Kunwa City and came to a secluded place outside the city. There were already people from Fuyunji waiting for her, and they welcomed her. Shui Ying ordered people to stand guard outside while she walked alone to a quiet place. She then took out a bright yellow talisman from her bosom and directly lit it up. This was the highest grade sound talisman, and each one was extremely valuable. But compared to the secret treasure of the Kunlun party, the Wind Whisper Disc, it was naturally still a bit inferior. But sound talismans were more convenient and easy to use. Although there were some limitations, such as the fact that two people couldn't communicate with each other and could only transmit a single message, over the years, sound talismans were still quite popular among the higher-ups of Zhengxianmeng. As the fire lit up, several magnificent spirit lights flickered, forming a ring that kept rotating. Shui Ying's expression was solemn as she said to the ring of spirit lights, "Give up on the pursuit and return to the Immortal City." As soon as she finished speaking, the magnificent ring of spirit lights suddenly trembled with incomparable intensity. There were faint tiny waves of air in the air that rushed towards the surroundings with incomparable speed, faintly emitting ear-piercing whistling sounds. This continued for a little less than the time it took to drink a cup of tea before it gradually calmed down. Then, the ring of spirit lights disappeared, and the sound talisman was completely burnt at this moment. Shui Ying swung her hand, and the last bit of ash fell from her white palm and floated in the wind. At the same time, in the faraway land of chaos, in a river valley that was blooming with a large expanse of bright flowers, a similar sound talisman was also burning in the hand of a woman in red. The strange ring of light flickered with a magnificent luster, flashing on her fingertips, causing her beautiful face to become a little bright red, as if she was a little excited. The woman in red stood in the river valley not too far away from the bloodthirsty demon flowers. If there were people familiar with the strange and cruel habits of these demon flowers, they would probably be able to see that she just happened to be standing on the edge of that invisible boundary. If she just went a little further, the bloodthirsty demon flowers would be alarmed, and they would start hunting for food. Under the clear sky, this scene of a beautiful woman and a beautiful flower was really beautiful, but in the dark, danger lurked everywhere, and life and death were only an inch away. Further away in the river valley, there were quite a few people standing. These people seemed to be wearing different clothes, but each of them was valiant and capable. They were all part of the elites of this hall in Zhengxianmeng and Fuyunji. For so many years, the devil cult had been on the decline, and Zhengxianmeng had been peaceful for a long time. Only Fuyunji, a hall that specialized in dealing with the devil cult, had all kinds of powerful people. At that moment, the red-clothed woman was looking at the ring of spiritual light in her hand the entire time. As for the surrounding people, they had all made way for her. All of them were quite a distance away from her. Evidently, this red-clothed woman's status in the floating clouds department was not low. After a short moment, the spirit light ring suddenly shook violently, and dazzling light flickered. Immediately after, a sentence came out of the light. It was unexpectedly the same sentence that Shui Ying had said through the sound transmission talisman outside Kunwa City in the Western continent. This voice wasn't loud, and only the woman in red standing next to the spirit light ring could hear it clearly. After hearing this sentence, she nodded slightly, then flicked her finger. The sound transmission talisman floated up and burned, scattering like dust on the ground behind her. She turned around and walked towards the entrance of the river valley. At the same time, she waved her hands, and the people in the surroundings of Fuyunji quickly gathered around her. "Miss Hong, did Hall Master Shui Ying send an order?" someone asked from the side. The woman in red, who was addressed as Miss Hong, smiled and nodded. "Yes, Sister Shui Ying sent me a message just now. She has given me instructions on this matter." Speaking up to here, she paused for a moment, then continued, "You all probably know that she has been in the western continent's Kunlun mountain for the past few days, so this order is most likely the order of that true monarch Tianlan above us." The people around her immediately became restless. Even in Zhengxianmeng, the largest power in the cultivation world, a soul formation true monarch was still an unreachable existence. It was enough to make people feel awe and respect. Not to mention that true monarch Tianlan was actually the legendary figure who founded Fuyunji. For so many years, he had always led Fuyunji to fight against the devil cult. He was a godlike figure in the hearts of almost everyone present, an existence that was a level higher than the other true monarchs in Zhengxianming. Seeing the expressions on everyone's faces and eyes, the woman in red smiled with satisfaction and said, "So everyone must do your best to follow this order. Don't be lazy." Everyone burst into laughter. Someone laughed and said, "Who dares to be lazy? Isn't Miss Hong here to watch? What order is it? Just say it." The woman in red nodded and smiled. Then, her expression suddenly became solemn. She said, "Receiving the order from Hallmaster, we will use all our strength to chase after the devil cult's black wolf. When we find him, we will kill him without mercy." Chapter 256. Why don't we go through that forest? Wouldn't it be faster to go through from there? In the disorienting land, White Lotus asked Lu Qin, pointing at the dark brown forest in front of them. By this time, Lu Qin had already called Atu back to his side. He flipped himself over and climbed up. At this moment, his old injuries had not yet healed and he had suffered new injuries. He really needed to rest, so he did not hide in front of White Lotus anymore. After hearing White Lotus's question, he just glanced in that direction and said lightly, "That is the snake forest. It likes to eat young girls with soft skin and tender flesh like you. If you want to go, you go, I won't go." After saying that, he lightly patted Atsu's head and walked towards the path beside the snake forest. It seemed that he intended to take a big detour. White Lotus looked at the snake forest a few more times, but no matter how she looked, she couldn't see anything strange about the forest. At most, the color of the trees was darker and there were more vines in the forest, but she didn't feel any danger. However, people were strange. Previously, no matter how she looked at the forest, she felt that there was nothing wrong with it. But after Lu Chen's words, White Lotus looked for a while and suddenly felt that the forest seemed to suddenly become dark. Sure enough, there was some inexplicable murderous aura seeping out, making people feel a chill in their hearts. What the hell, pretending to be mysterious all day, I don't even know if it's real or fake. White Lotus complained in a low voice, but after hesitating for a while, she still didn't dare to go in. She immediately turned around and followed behind Lu Qin. But after just 2 steps, her eyes lit up, and her attention suddenly turned from the snake forest to another target. Looking at Lu Qin and Atsu, she suddenly jumped in front of them, her eyes shining, and said with slight surprise, "Hey, this stupid dog can actually be used as a mount? Only those who are about to die from injuries have the right to sit." Lu Qin said lazily. He then laid on Atsu's body as if he had lost all his strength. He patted its head and said, "Let's go, Atsu. I don't know when our pursuers will come after us again." Atsu let out a low growl and stepped forward. White Lotus didn't give up. It could be seen that she was very interested in Atsu as a mount. She kept pestering it with words, wanting to ride it as well. After all, the mount was this mighty and majestic big black wolf, a ferocious and domineering demonic beast. Ordinary people rarely had the chance to ride it. Lu Qin was annoyed by her pestering. He rolled his eyes and said, "Don't talk nonsense. I told you just now that Atsu is not for anyone to ride. If you don't believe me, you can ask him." White Lotus immediately ran in front of Atsu. She looked very excited. At a glance, she really looked like a 10-year-old child. Lu Qin shook his head as he watched from the side. This girl Bai Lian was truly strange. Sometimes she seemed as innocent and pure as a young girl, but sometimes she was mature and ruthless to a frightening degree. Just how did she grow up all these years? Atu snorted disdainfully at White Lotus, who approached him with a smile on his face. Yes, he really snorted and continued to walk forward, as if he was ignoring White Lotus. White Lotus was furious. She stamped her feet and said, "Stupid dog, how dare you treat me like this? Do you believe that I won't kill you?" Lu Chen snorted and said, "What? If I don't listen to you and don't do what you want to hurt me? Where did you learn to be so overbearing at such a young age?" White Lotus glared at him. Her beautiful little face tightened, as if she was about to retort. But for some reason, she suddenly thought of something and became silent. After a while, she said, "If you don't want to give it to me, then don't give it to me. You make it sound like I want it very much." After saying that, she turned her head and walked forward. Who knew that after 2 steps, Lu Chen's cold and sarcastic laughter came from behind. He said, "Hee, your temper is quite big. If you really have such a backbone, don't follow me. Don't you know that this is also very annoying?" White Lotus suddenly turned around and stared at Lu Chen. Her face turned pale for some reason, and a murderous intent faintly emerged from her clear eyes. Atsu immediately stopped and growled. The hair on his neck slowly stood up. Obviously, he also felt some danger. Lu Chen looked the calmest. He looked at White Lotus and said with a smile, "What? Did I say something wrong? Did I hurt your heart? Or did I say something that made you uncomfortable? Let me think. Maybe it's that annoying word?" He looked at White Lotus, his face calm but a bit cold. He said, "It seems that someone has said this to you before, right? Since you were young, when you heard this sentence, did you also feel especially scared? Or when someone said this sentence, you once?" "Enough!" Suddenly, White Lotus shouted. Her eyes widened and stared at Lu Chen. She said coldly, "Has anyone ever told you that you are really a repulsive person?" "No." Lu Chen said, "No one has said that to me." White Lotus sneered and said, "Then you heard it now. Even if you want me to leave your side so that I won't be a burden to you, I still have to say that you are simply a scum. The most ruthless thing I have done is to see blood, but you trample on people's hearts. You poke out the secrets in other people's hearts, spread them out, and then step on the ground. Is it fun?" Lu Chen's face did not change. He said calmly, "You think too much." The corners of White Lotus lips curled into a mocking smile. "Sometimes, I really feel happy for EXN. Fortunately, she died a long time ago. Otherwise, if she were to be entangled with you in the future, I'm afraid she would be in even more pain and sorrow. That pain would be far worse than it is now." Lu Chen's face finally changed and became cold. He slowly sat up straight on the back of Ats. He stared at White Lotus and said coldly, "If you have something to say, come at me. Don't drag EXIN into it." White Lotus sneered and said, "Pretentious. Do you dare to say that EXIN didn't run into bad luck after she met you?" Lu Chen's face became colder. But for some reason, there was suddenly a trace of hidden guilt in the depths of his eyes. After a few words, White Lotus seemed to feel better. After sneering a few times, she turned around and strode away. Watching her gradually walking away, Lu Chen's cold face gradually eased. After a while, he suddenly smiled bitterly. Atsu turned around and looked at him. Lu Chen sighed and said, "We are both in the same predicament. We originally planned to go together. But in the end, she and I are like each holding a knife, desperately stabbing each other's heart. We won't stop until we see blood. Isn't this stupid?" Atsu nodded solemnly. "Get lost." Lu Chen kicked him. White Lotus left Lu Chen and Atsu and walked alone in another direction. Her heart was full of resentment and anger. She had long cursed that hateful man. Such a rotten person deserves to be hunted down, deserves to be hacked into 1,000 pieces, so as not to harm people anymore. He should just die. Bai Lian gritted her teeth as she muttered to herself. After walking a long distance away, she stood still for a while. After a while, she suddenly turned around and looked behind her, but there was nothing behind her. Not a single person could be seen. Furthermore, there was no sign of anyone in the distance. They had probably left already. White Lotus was so angry that her face turned pale. She clenched her hands tightly. If Lu Chen was standing in front of her now, she might really poke a few bloody holes in his body. Since she was young, White Lotus had a cold and quiet appearance in front of most people. But in reality, when there was no one behind her, this little girl's temperament had already gone to the extreme. She was the most intense and sensitive. And because of this, she had those cruel and bloody methods. Even Atsu was a little afraid of her. However, although she looked like a little crazy, she was not a completely crazy person. Although she was really angry this time, she still cursed a few times in the end. After cursing for a while, she turned around and left hatefully. It would be best if you died in this chaotic place and never returned to the outside world, Bai Lian muttered to herself as she walked forward. There was no obvious path in front of her. Lu Chen had chosen the wilderness that almost no one had been to before. There were no signs of human habitation along the way. White Lotus identified the direction. Just as she was about to take a step forward, she hesitated. She followed Lu Chen here because of the secret of the Atsu's blood food. But no matter how important this secret was, it was actually not necessary for her. Most of the time, it was because she really had nowhere to go. A 10-year-old little girl stood in the middle of the vast world. She looked around. It was desolate. There was nowhere to go. There was no one to see. She was like a lonely bird flying alone in the cold. She felt an inexplicable sense of panic and fear. She stood in a daze for a while. Then she walked forward. But after a few steps, her body suddenly trembled and she stopped. She frowned and looked forward. Behind a tree in front of her, an old man suddenly walked out. His face was very familiar. It was actually Zhuxian. Junior sister, long time no see. Zhuxian looked very calm. It was as if he had not seen her for a long time. He then said to White Lotus, "I'm here to bring you home." Chapter 257. He had traveled thousands of miles from Kunlun Mountain to this place, yet he had suddenly appeared here. This pair of martial brother and sister, who had once enjoyed limitless glory on Mount Kunlun and in the Kunlun party, appeared to be very different in age, almost like grandfather and grandson. However, this did not affect their status at all. This was because not long ago, they had even lived together on the winter peak among the clouds of the Kunlun party. They were both disciples of that deity transformation True Lord. However, in the blink of an eye, the world had changed. The True Lord had fallen, and the winter peak had been destroyed. The once flourishing Bai Chen's branch had instantly fallen, leaving behind only a scene of desolation. Among the rubble that was still piled up like a mountain under the clouds of the sky, there were still some remnants of their former glory. Now, in this desolate land of confusion, Zhuxian and White Lotus looked at each other. For a moment, they both felt an inexplicable sense of desolation and absurdity. After a while, White Lotus said, "Bring me back." Zhuxian nodded and said, "Yes, the Kunlun party is your home." White Lotus sneered and said, "Second senior brother, it's fine if you said that in the past, but now you can still say it so openly. I'm also very impressed." Zhuxian's expression did not change, as if he did not hear the sarcasm in White Lotus's words. He said, "Little junior sister, what I said is true. It's really too dangerous for you to wander the world at such a young age. Why don't you come back with me? As long as your cultivation is successful in the future, there is no place in this vast world that you can't go to whenever you want." White Lotus stared at Zhuxian and suddenly said, "Where will I stay when I go back?" Zhuxian was startled and said, "What?" White Lotus said, "I'm used to living in the winter peak. I don't want to stay anywhere else." Zhuxian smiled bitterly and shook his head. "Little junior sister, the winter peak has already been destroyed." White Lotus sneered, "Why don't you go back and plead for me to stay on Summer Peak for a few days?" Zhuxian still appeared to be calm and collected. He did not seem to be angry at White Lotus's unreasonable pestering. He said gently, "The Summer Peak is the sacred place of martial Uncle Tianlan's abode of immortal caves. Aside from him, no one in the entire sect can go there. I'm afraid I can't do that." "This won't do, that won't do. What's the point of me going back?" White Lotus waved her hand and said, "I won't go back. Second senior brother, you go back first and send my regards to eldest senior brother. Ask him to recuperate from his injuries and come back as soon as possible to restore the prestige of the sect." When the time comes, I will go back and rely on him. What do you say? Zhuxian shook his head and said, that won't do. Eldest senior brother is in seclusion to recuperate. No one knows how long it will take for him to come out. It might even be a few years or even a dozen years. Don't tell me you won't return to the mountain for such a long time? White Lotus gritted her teeth and looked at Zhuxian without saying a word. Zhuxian also looked at her calmly. They looked at each other for a long time, and the atmosphere seemed to suddenly become cold. After an unknown period of time, Bai Lian suddenly seemed to be tired of this hypocritical game of words. She snorted and said with a face full of disgust, second senior brother, can we not be so fake? Zhuxian sighed and still didn't speak. White Lotus said coldly, you said that you will take me back. It sounds nice to say that it's going home, but in fact, after I go back, I may have to go into seclusion for decades like eldest senior brother, right? Zhuxian was silent for a moment and said, little junior sister, you are born with 5 pillars and are a rare cultivation genius. Martial Uncle Tianlan is a person who loves talents. Maybe he will put the foundation of the sect first and cultivate you well. Bullshit. Do you believe that yourself? White Lotus scolded him bitterly. Zhuxian opened his mouth and then suddenly smiled. He sighed and said, actually, I really want to believe it. He looked at White Lotus and his face suddenly showed a trace of sincerity. He said, little junior sister, you see, if I don't even believe what I say, how can I make others believe it? What nonsense are you talking about? I don't understand. What I mean is, whether you believe it or not, I believe it myself. Zhuxian said gently and then walked towards White Lotus. At the same time, he said, little junior sister, listen to second senior brother, it's better to go back to the mountain with me. The land of chaos is in chaos and there will be a massacre soon. It's very dangerous for you to stay here. White Lotus took a step back and looked somewhat guarded. At the same time, she slightly raised her brows and said, what did you say? There is chaos and a massacre is about to happen. What do you mean? Zhuxian did not answer and only walked closer. White Lotus's face darkened. Suddenly, she let out a soft whistle and her body flew backwards. However, even though her movements were extremely fast, in the blink of an eye, Zhuxian's body had moved like a ghost and at the same time, he reached out to grab White Lotus's wrist. White Lotus was shocked and could not help but look at this second senior brother in a different light. In the past, in Hakushin Jinkuan's faction, Hakushin Jinkuan's position was needless to say. Among the 3 disciples, Spiritual Master Idlemonth was a great spiritual master of the Yuaning realm and also the sect leader of the Kunlun sect. Her status and cultivation were all top-notch. As for the 3rd disciple, White Lotus, although she entered the sect late and was young, her innate talent was too strong. She was publicly recognized as a rare talent. At such a young age, she could already look forward to the Yuaning realm and then pull the upper limit to the divine transformation realm. Because of this, White Lotus was also very famous among the elites of the Kunlun party. After all, how many years had it been since the Kunlun party had produced such a genius? In comparison, although Hakushin Jinkuan's 2nd disciple, Zhuxian, was also a veteran of the Jin Dan Friar sect and was publicly recognized as a person of virtue and virtue, in terms of fame, he was not as famous as senior brother Idlemonth's spiritual master. Recently, even Zhuxian's little junior sister was not as famous. Of course, this was a very depressing matter. However, things were often like this in the world. There was not much reason to talk about. In addition, Zhuxian had always been low-key and did not want to be in the limelight, so his presence was not strong. Even White Lotus herself, although she was usually taken care of by this second senior brother, in her heart, compared to her incomparably powerful master and eldest senior brother, she still looked down on this second senior brother. Those who did things and took care of others did not have much respect. Those who were high and mighty and did not manage things were instead respected. This was probably the way of the world nowadays. However, no matter how much White Lotus looked down on Zhuxian, now that they had really started to fight, Zhuxian, the veteran Jin Dan Friar sect's official 2nd disciple, still instantly displayed a shockingly powerful strength. No matter how White Lotus tried to break through, Zhuoxian was always one step ahead and blocked in front of her, making it impossible for her to leave. White Lotus used more than 10 methods of movement, but still could not break through Zhuoxian's obstruction. Her heart became more and more shocked. She even faintly felt that there was indeed a saying, "There is always someone better than you in the world." Although this was a very reasonable old saying, once she had this kind of feeling, there was no doubt that her self-confidence had already suffered a heavy blow. Finally, after dodging once again, Zhuoxian suddenly reached out and grabbed White Lotus's right wrist. He calmly said, "Little junior sister, stop fooling around. Follow me back to Kunlun Mountain." As he spoke, he slightly exerted force in his hand. Instantly, his palm was like an iron lock, clasping onto White Lotus's small hand. If he took another step forward, he would use his incomparably vigorous spiritual power to overwhelm this little girl. At this moment, Zhuoxian suddenly heard White Lotus sneer and say, "You are so arrogant now. Aren't you afraid that when I cultivate to the soul formation stage in the future, I will turn around and dismember your body into 1,000 pieces?" Zhuoxian's body trembled slightly, and his eyes were also a little stunned. One must know that White Lotus's talent was really too good. When others said that Yuanying and soul formation stage might be boasting, there was a very high chance that what she said would come true. To be remembered and hated by a future soul formation true monarch from now on? Even though Zhuoxian had always been calm and collected, at this moment, he couldn't help but have cold sweat on his forehead and his hair stood on end. However, at least he was not an ordinary person. No matter what, he was still a disciple that had been taught by Hakushin Jinkuin for many years. How could he be scared out of his wits just because of a few words? This five-pillar genius was naturally powerful. If she could become a soul formation true monarch in the future, she would be even more powerful. If that day really came, perhaps White Lotus could even become the most powerful soul formation true monarch in the history of the Kunlun party. But now, if she didn't succeed, then she didn't succeed. Right now, White Lotus was just a little girl whose cultivation was not as good as his. Zhuoxian's hand tightened. Intentionally or unintentionally, two of his fingers pressed on a certain pulse on White Lotus's fair wrist. White Lotus immediately let out a low cry. Half of her body went limp and at the same time, she was drenched in cold sweat. She angrily said, "Second senior brother, do you really want to help the evildoer?" Zhuoxian shook his head and said, "I'm doing this for your own good." T. White Lotus scolded. "How can you be so hypocritical? You obviously want to use me to ask for rewards, but you insist on saying that it's for my own good. You do bad things and still want good things, and then add another one to make your heart feel better? Do you have any shame?" Zhuoxian lightly said, "You're young and insensible, so I won't argue with you. But you're losing your status by doing this, and you're too noisy. Junior sister, I'm being rude, so I can only temporarily seal your mouth." Before he finished speaking, Zhuoxian suddenly raised his head. It seemed that he had felt something at that moment. Immediately after, he heard a long and mournful cry from behind him. A huge dark shadow pounced on him. The wind was mournful, and the momentum was overwhelming. Zhuoxian was shocked. In desperation, he had to let go of White Lotus's hand. At the same time, he retreated several steps. His fingers were like knives, drawing an arc in front of him. A golden shield of light suddenly appeared, blocking in front of him and protecting his heart. With a loud bang, a huge black wolf appeared out of thin air. Its eyes were flickering with a dark light, and it was incomparably fierce. And at the other end, a hand suddenly stretched out from the side, grabbed White Lotus's hand, and dragged her to escape desperately. White Lotus fixed her eyes and saw that it was Lu Chen who appeared. At first, she was surprised, then happy, and then angry. White Lotus gritted her teeth and shouted, "Why did you run over and join in the fun?" Lu Chen glanced sideways while running. Although the atmosphere was tense, he still laughed and said, "You're so fierce, but aren't you still running very fast with me?" Chapter 258. I'm not stupid. White Lotus grumbled and ran even faster. After the two of them ran for a while, they heard a loud rumbling sound behind them. When they turned around, they saw a cloud of dust and stones flying everywhere. It was so loud that they couldn't even see the silhouettes of people clearly. After a while, they saw a black figure suddenly burrow out from the cloud of dust and ran wildly towards them. It was Atsu. From the cloud of dust behind Atsu, an angry roar was heard. Zhuo Xian's figure soared into the sky. His eyes were bright and his face was filled with anger. His clothes were a little ragged. It seemed that he was caught off guard by the sneak attack and suffered a little loss. White Lotus was shocked and had a whole new level of respect for Atsu's combat power. One had to know that Zhuo Xian was a veteran Jin Dan friar of the Kunlun party, and was also a disciple of Hakushin Jinkuan. His skills were not ordinary. It was far from what an ordinary Jin Dan friar could compare with. But even so, this giant wolf Atsu still caused him some trouble. It was obvious that after the night of the full moon, this holy beast black wolf seemed to have advanced by leaps and bounds in some aspects. But why couldn't she see it normally? White Lotus suddenly thought of this problem. In that split second, she felt that the black dog seemed to be hanging around Lu Chen all day. Its lazy look was very deceptive. So this stupid dog was also treacherous and cunning, exactly like its master. Lu Chen suddenly felt a somewhat angry gaze coming from beside him. He looked at White Lotus strangely, but did not say anything. At this time, escaping was the most important thing. Zhuo Xian had already seen them when he rushed into the sky, and was rushing towards them with a face full of killing intent. White Lotus was about to rush in the direction that Lu Chen had gone when her wrist suddenly slanted. She was grabbed by Lu Chen and ran in another direction, which was the Black Snake Forest. White Lotus was shocked at first because she realized that her wrist had been grabbed by Lu Chen and she had forgotten to shake it off. The second thing that surprised her was the direction that Lu Chen was running in. She could not help but exclaim, "Hey, are you crazy? That's the Snake Forest. Didn't you say that we can't go in or we'll die?" "I lied to you," Lu Chen said calmly to White Lotus as he ran. "Bastard, that person's skills are extremely high. We can't underestimate him. If we get entangled by him, we'll be in trouble." Lu Chen lowered his voice and said to White Lotus, "There's no other way. We can only take the risk and go to the Snake Forest. After we go in, listen to me. If you're really bitten to death by a snake, I won't be able to save you." White Lotus was shocked again. She stared at him and said, Hey, you just said that you lied to me. Why are you suddenly talking about people dying? Do you even speak the truth? Shut up and listen to me." Before she finished speaking, Lu Chen had already interrupted White Lotus's complaints. They only heard the sound of wind and their visions suddenly darkened. The two of them had rushed into the Black Snake Forest. It was dark in the forest. They could see the long hanging vines of different thicknesses everywhere. Behind them, whistling sounds could be heard. The closest one was Atsu. He ran very fast and had already caught up with them. Zhuo Xian, who was a little further away, had an ashen face. He was running all the way and was quickly approaching them. The two people and a dog had just rushed into the snake forest when White Lotus's heart suddenly jumped. She saw that among the surrounding black vines, a few of them suddenly trembled slightly. They actually lifted up slightly, as if they were alive. Lu Chen didn't have the slightest intention of stopping to observe the surroundings. He directly pulled White Lotus and called for Atsu. They ran all the way into the forest. Wherever they passed, there was a lot of noise and movement. Thus, under White Lotus's shocked gaze, she saw that the surrounding countless vines of various sizes actually began to tremble slightly. Then, as if they were slowly coming to life, they began to slowly slide and stretch out on the strange dark brown tree trunks and branches. They really looked like countless dark snakes. No wonder this place was called the Snake Forest. A strange rustling sound that sounded like snakes and insects crawling began to come from all directions. The dark forest seemed to be startled and began to slowly wake up. Then, it emitted a kind of cold and evil aura that made people shiver from the bottom of their hearts. However, Lu Chen still ignored the movements around him. He still led White Lotus and Atsu all the way and rushed forward. The surrounding moving vines had already increased in number. There were even black vines suddenly hanging down from the sky, suddenly opening a terrifying big mouth to bite. The dark and terrifying spikes seemed to be in the mouth, like the fangs of a giant snake. At this moment, White Lotus's face could be said to be pale. Looking at the countless black shadows swaying around them, it seemed like they would be drowned by the countless snakes in the next moment. And behind them, there were also a few angry roars. It was Wuxian's voice. It seemed that he had also encountered a little trouble, as if he had fought with the strange vines in the forest. However, the most dangerous situation was of course still on Lu Chen's side. They ran in the thicker and thicker forest, and the situation also became more terrifying and dangerous. Seeing the hissing sound and the black clouds that filled the sky about to completely engulf them, White Lotus almost screamed. Lu Chen's eyes suddenly lit up. He pointed to the front and shouted, "Quick! Go over there!" White Lotus looked up and was shocked again. She saw in the depths of the forest in front of her, suddenly a light lit up. It turned out to be a strange tree that was completely different from the surrounding black trees. It was silver-white all over, and its size was moderate. It looked like an ordinary person would need to hug it. At the same time, whether it was the trunk or the branches of this tree, there was not a single strange snake-like vine. A beautiful and dazzling light emitted from this silver-white strange tree. In this dark forest, it was like a maverick fairy, emitting an enchanting halo. At this moment, the black vines behind and around Lu Chen suddenly seemed to be completely enraged. The whistling sound instantly became several times louder. Countless vines began to grow wildly, flying in the air and pouncing towards them. However, Lu Chen and White Lotus's movements were extremely fast. Without the slightest hesitation, they directly rushed towards the strange tree. At this moment, Black Wolf Atsu's speed also showed its amazing side at this moment. Only relying on his own strength when he was running for his life, he actually surpassed Lu Chen and White Lotus in an instant. He easily passed in front of them and was the first to touch the bottom of the silver-white strange tree. Finally, Lu Chen and White Lotus managed to reach the silvery white tree by a hair's breadth before the terrifying black vines could reach them. Sure enough, within 6 feet of this strange tree, all the black vines suddenly stopped and did not go any further. Looking at the place not far away, the vines that were dancing and twisting wildly like giant snakes twisted their bodies. White Lotus felt a little scared. But soon, they found that the vines around them began to decrease rapidly. After looking around, they found that many of the black vines around here were like snakes, swimming towards the center of another fierce battle ahead. In that dark shadow, they could vaguely hear Wuxian's howl getting louder and louder and more angry. Not long after, there was a sudden howl from there, and a dazzling light burst out from Wuxian's body. He had taken out an immortal sword magic weapon. The sword light was sharp, and it instantly cut off many vines around him. Suddenly, the pressure around them was relieved, and the originally extremely arrogant vines' offensive slowed down. However, this situation only lasted for a few breaths of time, and everyone only heard a sudden strange sound in the forest. All kinds of strange noises came one after another like snakes, insects, rats, and ants. Vines that were several times more than the ones that had been cut earlier came out of nowhere. Like a raging tide, they once again rushed towards Wuxian with a momentum that was several times more powerful than before. They tore at him from all angles, as if they wanted to tear his enemy into pieces. Wuxian was a little flustered for a moment. At the same time, at this critical moment, he suddenly felt a pain in his heart, and his spiritual power was a little sluggish. He was shocked at first, and then he only felt a chill in his heart because there were signs of poisoning in his body. In this forest, he didn't know where it came from, but it was actually filled with a poison that could poison cultivators. Wuxian didn't dare to continue fighting. With a long howl, he rushed into the sky, sword light shooting out in all directions. With a few peng sounds, he directly cut off the roots and vines above his head. Then he rushed out of the forest and flew into the air above his head. He didn't dare to stay for long and directly flew into the distance. As for the mission to bring junior sister White Lotus home, he naturally couldn't care about it now. If he lost his life, What meaning would there be to those missions? In the dense forest, Lu Chen and White Lotus both witnessed Zhuo Xian's encounter, and at the same time, watched him flee. Bai Lian surveyed her surroundings and her expression changed slightly. She realized that the chaotic lands was indeed as dangerous and unpredictable as the legend said. This was only the outskirts of the chaotic lands, but there was already such a dangerous place. Not to mention ordinary people, even if a cultivator accidentally entered this forest, the slightest carelessness would most likely lead to eternal damnation. After calming down a little, White Lotus turned to Lu Chen and asked, "What should we do now?" No matter what, it was Lu Chen who brought her to this snake vine forest. Presumably, he also knew the secret of this forest, as well as the way to lead everyone out. However, after Lu Chen looked at her, he asked, "Do you recognize this tree?" The tree he was referring to was naturally the beautiful silver-white tree in front of them. White Lotus shook her head, indicating that she didn't know. This tree is called the snake vine tree. In fact, this entire forest actually exists for this tree. Chapter 259. You're saying that all these vines and strange trees are there to protect this snake vine tree? White Lotus asked in disbelief. Lu Chen nodded and said, "That's right. This kind of tree is inherently evil. Once a seed falls to the ground and germinates until it grows, it will gradually start to corrode and control the surrounding flowers and trees. Then it will all become what we see now." He pointed to the surrounding black forest and said, "The land around the mother tree is completely surrounded. Any person or beast that strays into this black forest will be attacked by these giant snake-like vines. Not to mention ordinary people, even cultivators with slightly weaker cultivation will often be bitten to death. As for other birds and beasts, there are also many that die here throughout the year." White Lotus's face was a little pale. After subconsciously looking around, she asked Lu Chen, "But when we rushed in just now, I don't think I saw any dead people or beasts' bones?" Lu Chen looked at her as if he was looking at an idiot and said, "You don't think that these things only know how to kill and don't know how to eat, do you?" White Lotus didn't know why, but her body trembled a little. Her face showed a trace of a nauseous expression and said, "They actually eat." Lu Chen nodded and said, "This world is very cruel, isn't it?" The two of them turned together and looked at the strange silver-white tree in front of them. At this moment, in front of them, this strange tree seemed to be wrapped in a silver light. It looked brilliant, holy, and beautiful. It was breathtaking. If they hadn't seen it with their own eyes, perhaps it would be hard to imagine that there would be such a beautiful strange tree in this world. But what they didn't expect was that behind this beauty, there was a terrifying reality. White Lotus took a deep breath for a while and seemed to slowly calm down. But when she looked at the strange silver-white tree again, her eyes showed a look of disgust. She looked at the snake vine mother tree a few times and asked Lu Chen, "This is a little strange. Why did the vines not attack us after we got close to this tree?" Lu Chen thought for a moment and said uncertainly, "I'm not too sure about this. This was probably the nature of the snake vine tree. But it's also possible that this strange tree is weak and doesn't dare to let these terrifying vines get too close. Otherwise, it might even be eaten." White Lotus was skeptical. She always felt that Lu Chen's words were a bit unreliable, but there seemed to be no better explanation now. She could only snort fiercely and said, "Why don't we cut down this tree to avoid harming people again?" Lu Chen laughed and said, "I couldn't tell that you actually have this kind of intention to eliminate evil for the people." White Lotus rolled her eyes at him. But even so, a beautiful girl rolling her eyes at him had an extra charm and beauty to it. Lu Chen pondered for a moment and said, "Let's not cut it first. This snake vine tree should only grow in the chaotic lands. I've never heard of such a strange tree appearing in other places in the divine continent. It's probably because of the chaotic spiritual energy of the 5 elements in the chaotic lands that such a strange tree can be created. And according to what I know, once the snake vine mother tree dies or is seriously injured and loses control of the surrounding snake vines, the entire snake vine forest will go crazy and start to spread out and kill people. This will last for at least 6 to 7 days. If that's really the case, we won't be able to leave this place and will definitely die." After hearing this, White Lotus was not shocked but happy. She looked at Lu Qin and took a step forward and said, "What, could it be that you have a way to leave this place?" "It's all right, I have a rough idea." Lu Qin said, "But whether it will work or not, I'll have to try it out to know." As he said that, he slowly walked towards the silver tree. At the same time, a black light suddenly flashed in his hand and a black dagger appeared. It looked extremely sharp. This snake vine tree is very strange, and the surrounding vines are also very difficult to deal with. Even if ordinary cultivators cultivate to the level of Jindan Friar, they will still have a headache in this snake vine forest. They won't be able to escape easily, let alone the foundation establishment and chi refining cultivators below. Lu Qin smiled faintly and said, "But in this place, there is a treasure on the snake vine tree that can help us." White Lotus said, "What is it?" "Tree sap." Lu Qin walked to the side of the snake vine tree and carefully looked at the trunk. Suddenly, he slashed down with his dagger. The black dagger was abnormally sharp, and it directly cut a large hole in the tree. After a while, a milky white sap flowed out of the wound. White Lotus walked over and looked at the sticky white tree sap that emitted a strange smell. She couldn't help but frown and asked Lu Qin, "What's the use of this tree sap?" Lu Qin said, "You can smear this tree sap on your face, hands, feet, and even your clothes. The surrounding vines will naturally recognize you as part of their roots and will not attack you." White Lotus let out an "ah" sound and was a bit hesitant. However, she saw that Lu Qin had already reached out to take the white tree sap and began to smear it on his body. Bai Lian's expression twisted. She glanced at Lu Qin, who was rubbing tree sap on her body and face, as if she could not bear to look straight at him. She asked, "Will this really work?" Lu Qin snorted and ignored her. He only said lightly, "It's up to you if you don't want to listen to me. However, if you are killed by the surrounding vines in the future, don't complain to me." White Lotus gritted her teeth and suddenly stomped her feet. She seemed to have made up her mind. She stared at Lu Qin and said, "If you dare to lie to me, I will definitely kill you after we get out of here." After saying that, White Lotus also used her hand to receive the milky tree sap and then directly smeared it on her face. Suddenly, a strange smell assailed her nose. Moreover, the smell was strong and strange. White Lotus almost vomited. However, not long after, a faint fragrance wafted out from the tree sap. It was very comfortable and quickly alleviated the choking smell from before. Not long after, the two of them smeared the snake vine tree sap all over their body. Other than the strange smell around them, the two of them looked like they were surrounded by white bubbles from head to toe. It looked very strange. White Lotus looked at Lu Qin's appearance and then looked down at her own body. Her face was very ugly. Lu Qin obviously didn't care about the appearance of these things. He even took some time to smear the white tree sap on Atsu's body. This time, Atsu looked very obedient and didn't resist at all. After everything was ready, Lu Qin and the others waited in the forest for a while. After confirming that the surroundings were very quiet, they tried to walk out of the forest. Lu Qin was the first to walk out. Atsu and White Lotus were behind him, watching carefully with their eyes wide open. The black vines were hanging not far away from them. The gloomy forest was so quiet that it seemed as if evil spirits were peeping at them. However, something surprising happened. After Lu Qin slowly took a few steps forward, the vines didn't attack him. White Lotus cheered and was greatly encouraged. Black Wolf Atsu, who didn't seem to understand what was going on, was still looking at Lu Qin with his eyes wide open. Lu Qin stood in the same place for a while, then tried to take another 7 or 8 steps forward. At this moment, his body was surrounded by the black snake vine. However, it was quiet around him. The snake vine didn't attack him at all. Obviously, this was because he smeared the white tree sap on his body. White Lotus and Atsu didn't hesitate anymore and left the snake vine. Under Lu Qin's lead, they began to walk out of the forest. Of course, they couldn't be returning along the same path. Although White Lotus wanted to go back and secretly check on Zhuoxian's movements, Lu Qin didn't agree. After confirming the direction, they continued to walk in another direction. "Which direction is that?" White Lotus asked Lu Qin. Lu Qin's answer was also very simple. The White Lotus frowned. Although I'm not familiar with the disorienting lands, I have a general idea of the situation here. If you go south, won't you be entering deeper and deeper into the disorienting lands? That means it's getting more and more dangerous. When the time comes, don't let the righteous and evil paths kill you before you die in the depths of the chaotic lands. Lu Chen smiled. It's no big deal. At worst, if I can't beat them, I'll just run. White Lotus snorted. It's not like every opportunity is so good. Previously, when my second senior brother came over, he wanted to bring me back to Kunlun Mountain. I felt that something was wrong and didn't want to go back. But if he finds me again, I'm afraid I won't be able to escape. I can't care so much. Lu Chen said. Let's get out of this sea of suffering first. All right. Two people and a dog began to walk south in the forest. At the same time, they carefully observed their surroundings. Other than the terrifying vines, they would occasionally raise their heads to look at the sky, probably afraid that Zhuoxian would suddenly appear in the sky and discover their situation. However, Zhuoxian did not know if he was injured in the snake-creeping forest, as he disappeared without a trace after leaving the forest. As time passed, Lu Chen, White Lotus, and Atsu's party finally walked out of the snake vine forest. Walking out of the dark and gloomy forest, they saw that their surroundings had once again returned to the blue sky, white clouds, green mountains, and clear waters. The two of them subconsciously let out a long sigh, as if they had released all the pent-up frustrations in their hearts. But it was at this moment that Lu Chen's expression suddenly changed. He saw that over 10 men in black had appeared in front of them. They slowly surrounded them and stared at him. Chapter 260. Black shirt and black trousers, a full set of attire, even his face was covered with a black scarf, revealing only his two eyes. Such attire was exactly the same as the evil sect assassin who sneak attacked Lu Chen and White Lotus not long ago. His background was obvious. White Lotus sucked in a breath of cold air, took a step back. At the same time she said in a low voice, I say, what enmity do you have with the evil sect? Could it be that you killed their parents and close friends? I can't believe he's so against you. Lu Chen's expression was indifferent, seemed to have no response to this question, only coldly looked at those black-attired men. Different from the black-attired men who rushed out to sneak attack before, this batch of black-attired men were mostly very quiet, did not make any sound of abuse, but the murderous aura around them was far stronger than before, and looking at the distance and position distribution between those people, they seemed to be in harmony with each other, disorderly and well-proportioned, actually sealed off all possible escape routes, firmly sealing Lu Chen and the rest here. Rustling sounds, footsteps were heard from time to time. The oppressive feeling that those black-attired men exuded had a kind of earth-shattering momentum, pressing over bit by bit. The corner of Lu Chen's eyes twitched slightly, suddenly clenched his teeth, quietly said, Go back. White Lotus glanced at him, did not say anything, and the two of them once again slowly retreated back into that stretch of snake vine forest. Atsu also followed them back but looked a little more fidgety and uneasy, from time to time looked back, grimacing, revealing a ferocious look. Once again returning to that oppressive and gloomy forest, Lu Chen and White Lotus's expressions were very ugly. White Lotus even looked worriedly at that path. If those obviously powerful black-attired men rushed in, she and Lu Chen plus the three Atsu men, most likely it would be difficult to resist. However, to her surprise, the black-clothed men stopped outside the snake forest and did not continue to chase after her. White Lotus was surprised. She was about to say something to Lu Chen, but Lu Chen pulled her back to the side of the silver mother tree. At the same time, she heard Lu Chen say, It's safer here, and it's easier to talk. The tree's sap will disperse with the wind, and after a while, its aura will weaken. At that time, the snake vines around us might attack us. I see. Bai Lian nodded. However, she quickly furrowed her brows and began to size Lu Chen up with a strange look in her eyes. Lu Chen noticed her movements and asked, What's wrong? White Lotus thought about it and said, I think you're a little strange. Lu Chen said, What do you mean? White Lotus stared at him and said, Do you have any secrets in this snake forest that you haven't told me? Lu Chen shook his head and said, "What nonsense are you talking about? There's no such thing." White Lotus's eyes were still bright as she stared at Lu Chen and said, "No, I think there's something wrong with you. According to what you said before, this snake forest is extremely dangerous, but it doesn't make sense that you're the only one in this world who knows the secret of this forest, right?" Lu Chen said, "Of course not. Although the snake forest is rare, as long as one walks in the chaotic lands often, there will be people who know about it." White Lotus said, "If that's the case, why are we able to walk freely in this snake forest, but why are the people outside, including my powerful second senior brother, so afraid of this forest?" Without waiting for Lu Chen to speak, White Lotus continued, "Also, among the people who are chasing after us, there are obviously cultivators with high cultivation. Why are we able to walk straight in and reach the snake vine mother tree so easily, but the others can't? Could it be that the snake vine mother tree sees us in a different light and thinks we're good people?" Lu Chen originally wanted to say something, but after hearing White Lotus's words, he suddenly closed his mouth and looked at this unusually beautiful girl in silence. A cold light flashed in his eyes. "I didn't notice these things before, but now that I think about it, I feel that something is wrong." White Lotus looked at Lu Chen with bright eyes and said, "I think you probably have some secret, a secret that can make these fierce and powerful snake forests see us in a different light, right? What is it?" Lu Chen was silent for a long time, then suddenly sighed and said, "You're so smart and quick-witted. Do your parents know about it? They died a long time ago. They don't know anything." White Lotus, as usual, had no respect for her parents. Her eyes only stared at Lu Chen and said, "You admit it? Just what kind of method can actually affect this snake forest? Tell me quickly." Lu Chen smiled and said, "Will you tell me why you learned those fierce methods and the secret blood-feeding method before you went to Kunlun Mountain?" White Lotus's expression didn't change, and she said calmly, "I had a fortuitous encounter when I was young, and met a strange person who passed on his mantle, so I learned some skills." Lu Chen looked at her and smiled and said, "What a coincidence. I also met a master when I was young, and he taught me all kinds of killing and arson skills, so I have today." After saying that, he even added a sentence and said with a smile, "That master was also a big fat man, with a body full of fat like a pig." White Lotus coldly snorted and looked at Lu Chen with a somewhat unfriendly gaze. Obviously, she didn't believe even half a word that Lu Chen said. She sneered and said, "According to what you said, where is your heart of respect for your master? You actually dare to call your own master a pig in the whole world." Lu Chen laughed, but then after thinking about it he actually nodded and said to White Lotus, "What you said is also right, in the whole world, probably only I dare to call him a pig." "Pay!" White Lotus spat and said hatefully, "If you don't want to say it, then don't say it, who cares? What do we do now?" White Lotus asked Lu Chen. Lu Chen was silent, many thoughts turned in his mind, and he was thinking carefully. Previously in the various situations in this snake forest, in fact, what White Lotus said was indeed true. This little girl was indeed somewhat abnormal. At such a young age, not only was her talent amazing, even her intelligence and sharpness were difficult for ordinary people to match. In Lu Chen's body, there was indeed a secret that could affect the surrounding forest, causing the originally fierce and terrifying snake vines to often be a beat slower when they attacked, which allowed him and White Lotus to smoothly run to the mother tree. But of course, this method was not taught to him by true Lord Tianlan in the past, nor was it a supernatural power that he learned in the evil sect, but was that seed. That mysterious seed embedded in his body, originated from the legendary Tree of God, which was passed down from ancient times in the evil sect. This Tree of God was the ancestor of all trees in the world, and the only bridge that connected the three worlds. However, in the more than 10 years that Lu Chen had obtained this seed, he had never felt any similar power from this seed. The greatest function of the Tree of God to him was to suppress the curse of the black fire, which allowed him to live until today. But the strange thing happened on the night of the full moon, when that earth-shattering pillar of light pierced through the heaven and earth. Lu Chen faintly felt that the seed in his body seemed to have some changes, and the ability to slightly influence and control some of the flowers and plants in the world, was gradually discovered by Lu Chen on the road of escape after that. This was of course a great secret, and Lu Chen had no intention of telling White Lotus. In short, both of them had their own ulterior motives and refused to reveal their own secrets, so they just laughed it off. But the predicament before them was still right in front of them, and Lu Chen also felt that it was a little tricky. The special ability of the Tree of God Seed was only in a slightly awakened state. At most it could only slightly delay the attack speed of the surrounding snake vines, but when it came to wanting to control this snake vine forest, it was still too far away. But if they were to be trapped here, it was obviously not a long-term solution. Lu Chen frowned tightly, and just as his mind was turning rapidly, White Lotus asked again, "How about we apply some more tree sap and then escape from another direction? Anyway, this forest is so big, I don't believe that they can seal off all the exits." Lu Chen's expression looked a little solemn. He turned his head to look at the silver-white snake vine mother tree and said, "This mother tree doesn't look very thick, it should have grown not long ago. We also can't take too much tree sap, or else we will hurt the roots of this mother tree, and will cause the surrounding snake vines to go crazy." White Lotus was shocked, and also looked at the snake vine mother tree and said, "How many more times can we take tree sap?" Lu Chen calculated in his heart, and said, "We need to apply it to 2 people at a time, and Atsu's body is much bigger than ordinary people, so it needs a lot of tree sap. I think we can only take tree sap 1 more time at most." Only 1 chance? White Lotus was a little surprised, and suddenly a look of hesitation appeared on her face. They could only take tree sap 1 more time. In other words, if they wanted to escape from this snake vine forest, it was almost the last chance they had left. This last time, they could only succeed and not fail. If they failed, whether they were blocked by others, or the forest went crazy, perhaps only death would await them. Both of them fell silent and stood beside the snake vine mother tree in deep thought. Only Atu seemed to be more relaxed. He paced back and forth, and after a while, he suddenly strolled to the side of the snake vine mother tree. He looked at this beautiful silvery white mother tree from head to toe. He lifted his hind leg and peed on the roots of the tree. Lu Chen saw this scene, although he was anxious, but he couldn't help but find it funny, and thought, this dog Atsu was still a little different from the rest. But just as this thought flashed across his mind, his body suddenly shook, and he thought of the word, different. Different. It really seemed to be a little different. His eyes suddenly changed, became a little deep, and at that moment, it seemed like his soul was also impacted by some kind of thought. Even his breathing became heavier. White Lotus felt it, and looked at Lu Chen and asked, "What's wrong with you? Did you think of something?" Lu Chen was silent for a moment and suddenly said, "Just now those black-attired people outside, you said they were evil cult killers." Chapter 261. White Lotus was taken aback and said, "Isn't that so? It's exactly the same as those killers who came for you before." Lu Chen was silent for a moment, slowly shook his head and said, "It's not the same." White Lotus said, "What is it?" Lu Chen seemed to still be pondering, so even the speed of his speech was much slower than usual, but his tone was very calm and said, "They seem to be quite quiet." Bai Lian thought back to the black-clothed men she had seen outside the snake overgrowth forest. As expected, most of the time, they did not speak. However, she quickly said in annoyance, "They're here to kill you, not to chat with you. Is it strange not to speak?" Lu Chen did not mind the sarcasm in White Lotus's words. After pondering for a moment said, "You don't understand, when those evil faction people see me, most of the time their eyes are red, even if some of them are calm and collected, but with so many people, it's impossible that all of them did not scold me." White Lotus laughed, pointed to Lu Chen and said, "You are so strange, are you born to be cheap? Others did not scold you, instead you feel uncomfortable?" Lu Chen was not angry, only pondered alone and then slowly said, "No, now the more I think about it, the more I feel that there is something wrong with those people. Other than their reaction when they saw me, they also had a murderous aura, but the murderous aura did not seem to be particularly strong. You should still remember the imposing manner of those few evil faction killers who sneaked an attack on us?" The last sentence, Lu Chen turned his head and asked White Lotus, White Lotus was stunned for a moment and said, after what you said, it seems that those few evil faction killers at the front were indeed more ferocious and agitated. Lu Chen squinted his eyes slightly and said, also, those black-attired men just now formed a formation together during the fight. This kind of fighting method is also not commonly seen in the evil faction. Most of the evil faction people are valiant in martial arts casting spells to fight. Very few of them can form a formation to defend against the enemy at any time and place. This kind of method is more commonly. He suddenly stopped. White Lotus heard the important part and could not help but ask, who? Lu Chen's expression became a little strange. After a while he calmly said, Fiyunji. I've always found it strange. Why did I purposely choose a desolate and uninhabited path, even when I entered the chaotic land of chaos? Why did I choose a path that even I hadn't walked before? Logically speaking, no one should have been able to detect me in advance. But every time, the evil faction killers always seem to be able to catch up to us, and then launch a sneak attack, using all sorts of methods. But every time, the evil faction killers always seem to catch up. White Lotus's first reaction was to clear her name. Then she thought for a while and said, or it's because you have a deep grudge with the devil cult. They remember you and have some means to catch you. Well, for example, those sinister means of casting spells or something. Lu Chen smiled and said, I won't. White Lotus was a little unconvinced and said, you know, again, the evil faction has been passed down for so many years, they have been fighting with the good faction for thousands of years and yet they have not fallen. Do you know what methods they have? Lu Chen said, I think I know a little. Do? White Lotus suddenly found that she did not know what to say. In the end, she could only look at Lu Chen with disdain and said, you only know how to brag. Lu Chen ignored her and lightly said, if the evil faction really have this kind of method, they should have found me in these years. Since they couldn't find me, then there shouldn't be any special strange method that I don't know. On the other hand, Fiyunji. White Lotus saw that Lu Chen was suddenly in a daze, as if he was in a daze, couldn't help but pushed him and said, hey, what's wrong with you? Lu Chen suddenly turned his head and stared at her. At the same time he raised his right hand, a black light flashed and that black dagger suddenly appeared in his palm. White Lotus's expression froze, stepped back and said, what are you going to do? Lu Chen looked at her, did not speak but did not have the intention to attack her. After a moment of silence, he suddenly walked a few steps to the side and then untied his upper clothes. White Lotus was somewhat surprised, did not know what Lu Chen was going to do. But whether it was her age or her current temperament, she did not care about the precaution between men and women, do not look at indecent things. Therefore she did not blush like some girls and cover her eyes and so on. Instead she looked straight at Lu Chen, trying to see clearly what Lu Chen was going to do. When Lu Chen untied his upper clothes, a relatively perfect man's flesh and blood body was revealed. Thanks to that mysterious seed of the god tree, he had soaked in that mysterious pond in the mysterious tree hole for 10 years to resist the curse of the black fire. An additional benefit was that the incomparably rich vitality in the water had erased most of the original scars on his body, almost giving him a perfect body. Now, no one knew that 10 years ago, his body was covered with innumerable scars of various sizes, each of which was a scar left behind by unerasable pain. Lu Chen's gaze swept across his body. After a moment, he raised the incomparably sharp black dagger with his right hand and calmly placed it on an extremely inconspicuous place below his left rib. Then, without changing his expression, he exerted a little force in his hand and the sharp blade immediately pierced into his flesh. White Lotus's expression changed a little, and the way she looked at Lu Chen seemed to have changed a little. And Lu Chen's expression also slightly twisted the moment the blade entered his body, as if he felt a trace of pain, but very quickly he calmed down again. He stared fixedly at the flesh under that seemingly perfect piece of skin. Suddenly his wrist shook, a black light flickered, and the black dagger spun at an extremely fast speed. Without a sound, a small piece of flesh was cut off just like that. Fresh blood immediately gushed out, and was immediately pressed down by Lu Chen. But his attention was clearly not on his own wound, but on the small piece of flesh that originally belonged to him that had fallen on the ground. In the bloodstain, other than the dark red blood, there seemed to be a glimmer of light flashing past. A strange expression slowly appeared on Lu Chen's face. It seemed to be a sense of loss, but also an extremely deep disappointment. It was like a traveler who had walked a long road for his entire life, and when he finally reached the end, he discovered that he had walked on a dead end, and there was no more way to go. He slowly squatted down, and used the dagger in his hand to poke at the flesh on the ground. Within the bloody light, a small 5-colored glyph slowly appeared. Although small, it was extremely fine. The lines of the glyph that were as thin as hair were abnormally clear, sketching out a complex and twisted glyph formation. At this time, White Lotus had unknowingly walked to his side. She also squatted down beside him and softly asked, "What's wrong? What is this?" "This is the soul calming glyph." Lu Chen stared at the small glyph in the flesh on the ground, but even his voice was slightly different at this moment. It was no longer so calm, and there was some unnoticeable excitement. "This is an extremely profound secret technique of Zhengxianmeng Fiyunji. It is priceless, and the price is extremely high. Through this soul-calming glyph, they can know some of the secrets of the shadow, and can track their movements without anyone noticing." He looked at the piece of flesh, and after a while, he suddenly smiled and said, "A long time ago, after the matter was done, someone told me that this thing was already useless, and that it was discarded." White Lotus also became silent. She did not have much understanding of Lu Chen's background and experiences, but after those words just now, she still faintly guessed some clues, and could roughly guess some things. She looked at the piece of soul-calming glyph. In the pool of blood, she could clearly feel that the glyph was flickering with a faint light, and spiritual power was flowing on it. It was clearly operating normally. If it was really discarded, this glyph should not have any reaction, and after such a long time, perhaps it had already become one with Lu Chen's flesh. So, she also had an inexplicable sense of absurdity and difficulty. After a while, she softly said, "You believe it?" "Yes, I believe it," Lu Chen said, and then laughed and said softly, "So silly, right?" There was a strange silence in the dark forest for a long time. After a long time, White Lotus sighed and said, "To be able to be jointly hated and schemed against by the world's good and evil forces, you are probably the first." The corner of Lu Chen's mouth twitched slightly, and then he took a deep breath, suddenly stood up, and began to put on his clothes again. As he turned around and took the first step, he directly crushed the soul-calming glyph. Resolute and decisive, without any hesitation. "The situation now is worse than I thought." Lu Chen walked in front of White Lotus and did not speak any nonsense. He looked into her eyes and said, "It's best if you don't stay with me. Otherwise, you might really die." White Lotus frowned and said, "I say, the way you speak, it always makes people feel a little uncomfortable. Why was it that when we thought it was the evil sect killers chasing after us, we joined hands to fight against the enemy and escaped here without any fear? But once you know that the group of people standing outside now are from Fiyunji, you are afraid to this extent." Lu Chen shook his head and said, "I am not afraid, but sometimes, the trump card of us good faction people is actually much stronger than those evil sect people who are struggling at death's door. When we do things, we also become more and more unscrupulous." Speaking till here, his mouth suddenly twice and sneered and said, "This is also thanks to a certain big fatty." White Lotus had yet to react and asked in surprise, "What big fatty?" Lu Chen was just about to speak. Suddenly he heard a series of whistling sounds coming from the distance of the snake-overgrown forest, with a trace of surprise and panic. He indifferently glanced at the already broken glyph, and then said to White Lotus, "Let's go, they probably found out." Chapter 262. When they cut open the snake vine mother tree for the second time to extract the sap, White Lotus specially observed this silvery white and abnormally beautiful mother tree. As expected, as the sap flowed out, the halo of the snake vine mother tree seemed to have dimmed a lot. And when they smeared the sap on their bodies again, the luster of the snake vine mother tree was already on the verge of collapse. Obviously, the situation was just as Lu Chen had said before. They only had one last chance. Lu Chen glanced at the snake vine mother tree, and his expression didn't change much. He directly walked out. Atsu followed behind him, and White Lotus hesitated for a moment, but also followed. "You're still following me?" Lu Chen didn't look back, but his voice could still be clearly heard. "You really don't want to live anymore?" White Lotus looked at his back and said, "Tell me the secret of the blood food on Atsu's body, and I'll leave immediately." Lu Chen's footsteps paused for a moment, then he turned his head, and a strange and complicated expression appeared on his face. He said, "I let you go because I'm worried that you'll be in danger if you follow me. I'm afraid that I'll harm your life. This is my kindness to you. But why do I feel like you're using my kindness to threaten me?" White Lotus thought for a moment, but nodded and said, "That seems to be the case." Lu Chen said indifferently, "Do you think that good people are easy to bully? I sympathize with you and think for your sake, so you deserve to be threatened and bullied?" White Lotus remained silent. Lu Chen shook his head and said, "There's no such logic in this world." White Lotus walked to his side. She wanted to say something but hesitated. In the end, she sighed and said, "I said the wrong thing. But I still want to say that even if there's no such logic in this world, there are many such things in this world." This time, it was Lu Chen's turn to fall silent. A long while later, he softly sighed and said, "Therefore, I will not be a good person." In the end, Lu Chen and White Lotus were separated in this snake-overgrown forest. White Lotus didn't feel that her relationship with this man had reached the point of life and death, nor did she have the intention to go on a dangerous journey with him. Lu Chen also didn't reveal any secrets to White Lotus until they parted ways. When they parted ways in the deep and dark snake forest, White Lotus asked Lu Chen if they would have a chance to meet again. Lu Chen shook his head. White Lotus looked at him and said, "Are you resigned to your fate and don't intend to come back alive?" Lu Chen knew that was not what he meant. Who knew what would happen in the future? If fate allows it, let's meet again in the future. After saying these words, they brushed past each other and walked in an unknown direction. After walking for a while, Bai Lian turned back to look. She could see the figure of the man walking away from her. Beside him was the giant black wolf, as if it was the only companion he had in his life. White Lotus chose a path towards the northeast. Just like the places she had passed before, the snake-overgrown forest was filled with black hanging vines. They hung on the seemingly omnipresent black trees like giant sleeping snakes. White Lotus had seen how terrifying these giant snakes were once they woke up not long ago. Thinking of what Lu Chen meant when he said that this forest would eat things, she couldn't help but feel a chill down her spine even though she was extremely brave. However, after smearing the snake-overgrown mother tree's tree sap on her body, the vines remained very calm. They did not have any intention of attacking her. Just like that, White Lotus walked out of the snake-overgrown forest without any mishaps. When she reached the edge of the snake-overgrown forest, White Lotus deliberately looked out. There was no movement in the surroundings, especially when the murderous men in black from before did not appear here. This allowed her to heave a sigh of relief, and then she swiftly walked over. However, she'd only walked around 3 m out of the forest when something flashed before her eyes. A black-clothed figure flashed out from behind a hill at the side, and he held an immortal sword and directly obstructed her path. White Lotus's face darkened. She focused her attention and took precautions. However, the man in black did not seem to have any intention of attacking her. He only glanced at her and a hint of surprise flashed through his eyes. He seemed to be slightly surprised at White Lotus's young age. "Young lady, where's your companion from before?" the man in black asked. His expression was actually not very stern. White Lotus snorted and did not reply. Instead, she glanced left and right, looking like she was looking for an opportunity to escape. The man in black's gaze immediately sharpened. He frowned and said, "Don't make things difficult for yourself. You'd better hurry up." Before he could finish speaking, White Lotus's figure suddenly flashed, and she had already flown to the side. The man in black was furious. He extended his hand and grabbed. The hand seemed to be far away, but suddenly, it seemed to have used some kind of ability and suddenly grew several times its original size. It seemed to grow with the wind and directly grabbed White Lotus's back. White Lotus's body suddenly sank in midair. Her entire body suddenly landed on the ground, and then she turned around. Instantly, a layer of frost and snow drifted in front of her. With a few cracking sounds, the strange hand was actually frozen. The man in black in the distance made a sound of surprise, and his gaze towards White Lotus immediately became slightly different. The black hand shook a few times, shaking off the surrounding ice and snow, and at the same time it shrank back. White Lotus took the opportunity to continue flying, but at this moment, she suddenly heard a whistling sound behind her. The sound seemed to be piercing through the air, and she could not help but feel her heart skip a beat. She subconsciously looked back, and her face immediately paled. The immortal sword in the black-robed man's hand glowed brightly and emitted a dazzling azure light. One split into two, two into three, and in an instant, there were actually 50 to 60 dazzling azure lights that were around 5 feet in length. They formed an incomparably fierce azure sword formation that covered the heavens and the earth as it rushed over. The sword formation was extremely powerful, and in an instant, it surrounded White Lotus and directly slashed down. White Lotus was greatly shocked, retreated a few steps and used all her strength to dodge, but she still could not escape from the range of this magnificent sword formation. Instead, she was quickly forced to a dead end, seeing that the tens of green lights were about to land and pierce through her body. At that moment, a wave of despair surged in White Lotus's heart. At the same time, she was also bewildered. This person's cultivation was obviously extremely high. He was definitely not an ordinary person. What was his identity and background? Right at this critical moment, a long howl suddenly sounded out, and then a brilliant golden light descended from the sky. It spun rapidly in midair, and there was actually the sound of thunder in the sky. It was like a bolt of lightning from a clear sky, and it suddenly fell into the green light sword formation. The green light first sank, and then it actually expanded against the trend, and instead rolled up and pounced towards that golden light. A figure appeared from the golden light. It was Wuxia. However, at this moment, Wuxia's expression was extremely solemn. He looked at the man in black in front of him, and with a shake of his wrist, the golden light shone brightly again, but it transformed into a dazzling golden wheel in midair, rumbling as it rotated, and met the green light head-on. The golden and azure immortal lights collided with each other without any finesse. There was a loud bang and the shockwaves rose and fell. White Lotus only felt a roar in her ears. She took a few steps back, her head still ringing. The golden and green lights slowly retracted, and in midair, Wuxia and the man in black hovered in midair, facing each other. After a moment, Wuxia took a deep breath, and was the first to put away the magic treasure in his hand. He cupped his hands and said, "Thousand Extremes dark green sword, which senior brother of the Thousand Extremes sect are you?" The man in black stared at Wuxia's face, and after a moment, he nodded slightly. With a wave of his hand, the sky full of green lights also fell and dissipated, turning back into an immortal sword and returning to the sword box on his back. Then, he reached out and took off the black cloth on his face, revealing the face of a man with thick eyebrows and a square face. He looked to be about 30 years old, and he had a calm bearing. He said, "I am Ho Zhenglong of the Thousand Extremes sect. Your golden arc-wheel is also impressive. Could it be that you are from the Kunlun sect?" Wuxia said, "I am Wuxia of the Kunlun party." Ho Zhenglong frowned slightly, and after a moment of thought, a trace of surprise suddenly appeared on his face. He said, "Could it be that you are Wuxia, senior brother Zhua of the Hakushin Jinkuan sect?" Wuxia said, "That's me." The Thousand Extremes sect was not a small sect, but one of the 5 famous sects of Zhengxianmeng that were on par with the Kunlun sect. There were countless experts and cultivators in the sect. Before today, Wuxia had never heard of Ho Zhenglong, but just based on the Thousand Extremes dark green sword he had just used, his momentum was vigorous, sharp, and steady. When he attacked, it was like a storm, and when he retreated, it was like a whale sucking in water. He could go up and stop at will, so it was obvious that this person's cultivation was very high, and his foundation was very solid. He must be an outstanding talent that appeared in the Thousand Extremes sect in recent years. Hou Jinglong also seemed to be very respectful towards Zhuo Xian, but the look in his eyes seemed a little strange. Zhuo Xian had a rough idea in his heart. It had been some time since the night of the full moon, and the news of Hakushin Jinkuan's death should have spread, so it would not be strange if Hou Jinglong knew about it. However, of course, he would not tell Hou Jinglong about these things, but after sizing up Hou Jinglong's attire, he frowned and said, "Brother Hou, your attire seems to be." Hou Jinglong laughed and said, "I won't hide it from Zhuo Xixiang. Right now I'm working for the Floating Clouds division of the True Immortal Alliance. Right now, I'm working with the brothers in my division to do something big. My disguise is to disguise as a demon from the evil cult." Zhuo Xian suddenly understood, nodded and said, "I see." Hou Jinglong laughed, and then his gaze fell on White Lotus, who was standing beside Zhuo Xian, and then his expression turned serious, pointed at White Lotus and said, "Brother Zhuo, may I ask, when you saved this little girl just now, do you know her identity?" Zhuo Xian nodded and said, "Yes, her name is White Lotus, and she is my junior sister. If I have offended you in any way, please forgive me, Brother Hou." Hou Jinglong was stunned for a moment, and said in astonishment, "She is your junior sister, then she is also Hakushin Jinkuan's disciple?" Zhuo Xian hesitated for a moment, and said, "Yes, junior sister is my teacher's last disciple." Hou Jinglong frowned, looked at White Lotus, and his face suddenly darkened, and said, "That is strange. May I ask why your junior sister was with that devil sect demon before?" Chapter 263. Evil Sect, Evil Person? Zhuo Xian was obviously taken aback, turned to look at White Lotus, at the same time said, "It can't be? Junior sister, is what he said true?" White Lotus snorted, then said neatly, "It's fake." Zhuo Xian frowned and raised his head to look at Hou Jinglong. Hou Jinglong's expression was calm as he looked at White Lotus and said, "When you first came out of the snake forest, you were following that evil cult demon. I didn't lie about that, did I?" White Lotus said, "I am with that person, but he is not the evildoer of the evil cult." These words of hers were said with incomparable firmness, with an air of decisiveness that could sever nails and chop iron. Hou Jinglong was stunned for a moment, and Zhuo Xian also pondered for a moment, cupped his hands and said to Hou Jinglong, "Hou brother, my junior sister is talented and intelligent, deeply favored by my teacher Hakushin Jinkuan. Her family background is also excellent, so in terms of sentiment or reason, it is indeed impossible for her to be evil sect people. There must be some misunderstanding before?" Hou Jinglong obviously had some respect or fear for Zhuo Xian's identity, and in addition, Zhuo Xian's words were indeed reasonable. For a moment he could not help but hesitate, muttered, "But that person is also evil sect." "Who said he is evil sect people?" White Lotus suddenly said loudly, "Have you seen the evil sect people who were chased for thousands of miles by a large group of evil sect people, running for their lives all day?" Hou Jinglong was shocked, said, "Evil sect people are also chasing that person?" White Lotus said, "Yes, I was almost killed previously, luckily Lu Chen saved me." Hou Jinglong frowned, a glimmer flashed deep in his eyes, seemed to be thinking about something. And Zhuo Xian looked at him, coughed, said, "Hou brother, I think what junior sister said may be somewhat reasonable. But right now I have something important to do. I need to bring junior sister back to Kunlun Mountain as soon as possible. I will take my leave first." Hou Jinglong hesitated for a moment before he nodded slowly and cupped his hands together. "If that's the case, please do as you wish, senior brother Zhuo." Zhuo Xian nodded and then reached out to grab White Lotus's wrist. White Lotus subconsciously struggled, but in the end she still sighed and obediently followed Zhuo Xian. Hou Jinglong's brows furrowed tightly as he watched the two of them leave. It was as if there was something he could not figure out. After a long time he muttered to himself, "This doesn't seem right." Zhuo Xian brought White Lotus away from Hou Jinglong's place. After walking for a while, Zhuo Xian stopped, one hand still holding White Lotus's wrist. At the same time his other hand took out a glowing, oddly shaped talisman from his bosom. When White Lotus saw that talisman, Her face suddenly changed, her body struggled, but Zhuxian's hand that was holding her wrist exerted force. White Lotus suddenly groaned in pain, her body went limp. Then Zhuxian stretched out his hand and stuck that talisman on the back of White Lotus's waist. That talisman suddenly lit up, transformed into several silver lights that wandered on White Lotus's body, like a silver snake raising its head, and also like lightning trembling. At that moment, White Lotus's face was reflected in silver. After a moment, these silver lights disappeared into her body. White Lotus's body shook, her face became pale, but there was anger in her eyes. She stared at Zhuxian and sneered, "Second senior brother, your cultivation is so much higher than mine, but you still used such a rare thing like the Forbidden Spirit Talisman to suppress my cultivation. This is too superfluous." Zhuxian was silent for a moment, then gently let go of White Lotus's wrist and said, "Little junior sister, I have no evil intentions towards you. It's just that you are too young and the world outside the mountain gate is too dangerous for you. I have no choice but to bring you back to the mountain. I did this because I was afraid of hurting you." White Lotus sneered, obviously she did not believe Zhuxian's words. Zhuxian did not care and just said, "You will understand in the future. Let's go back to the mountain." White Lotus secretly used her qi several times, but it was repeatedly interrupted in her Dantian's qi. She could not use her spiritual power to activate various magical powers. It was obvious that she was restricted by the magical Forbidden Spirit Talisman. She gritted her teeth and walked forward as if she had accepted her fate. Zhuxian followed behind her for a few steps and asked, "Little junior sister, before that Thousand Extremes sect's host senior brother said that you were with that person. That person is really not from the evil faction?" "I said he is not," White Lotus said snappily. Zhuxian nodded and said, "Then where did he go now?" "How would I know? Anyway, he went in the opposite direction after separating from me." White Lotus suddenly became vigilant. She looked at Zhuxian and said, "Why are you asking this?" Zhuxian smiled and said gently, "Don't be afraid. I'm just casually asking. My priority now is to escort you back to Kunlun Mountain. I don't care about anything else." White Lotus's expression relaxed a little. She snorted and continued to walk forward. Zhuxian's footsteps slowed down a little. He looked to the side and saw that behind a forest several feet away, a figure had quietly appeared. It was he. He nodded at Zhuxian from afar. His face didn't show much expression. He turned around and left. The direction he walked in was the opposite direction of Zhuxian and White Lotus. Zhuxian stared at He's back for a moment. Then he stepped forward and caught up with White Lotus. "Second senior brother." White Lotus suddenly called out. Zhuxian responded and said, "What's wrong? When Master died, what did he look like?" Zhuxian's body shook slightly. After a moment of silence, he said softly, "I didn't see it with my own eyes. I don't know. A deity transformation stage lord died just like that." White Lotus' face, which still carried a trace of childishness, suddenly became a little sad, and said, "Even if we cultivate for the rest of our lives, it's hard to say whether we can reach Master's realm, not to mention the higher realm of immortality. Second senior brother, tell me, why do we have to work so hard to cultivate?" Zhuxian was silent for a long time. He said, "You're so young. Why do you think so much?" White Lotus said, "It's natural. Haven't you thought about this, second senior brother?" Zhuxian smiled and said softly, "I have thought about it. I have thought about it many, many times." Lu Chen walked in the opposite direction of White Lotus. He was probably heading southwest. In short, he was trying his best to avoid those men in black, no matter who they were. While walking in the forest, Lu Chen didn't speak for a while. He remained silent. Atsu followed beside him. He seemed to feel something was wrong and looked up at him from time to time. "I'm fine," Lu Chen said to Atsu, "but if I'm really found by them and I have nowhere to run, what will you do, Atsu?" Atsu tilted his head as if he was thinking. Lu Chen praised and said, "You actually know how to think now. You're not so stupid after advancing." "Woof woof," Atsu barked. Lu Chen grinned and said, "Looking at your mighty and majestic appearance, it's really funny to suddenly bark like a dog." As he said that, he reached out and hugged Atsu's neck. Atsu stuck out his tongue and licked his face. It felt a little warm. If I really can't do it, you can run by yourself. Lu Chen leaned against Atsu's huge head and suddenly said softly. Atsu didn't respond. Lu Chen didn't know whether he understood or not. Lu Chen didn't say much. After a while, he suddenly sneered and said, Requiem talisman, Requiem talisman? Do you know what Requiem means? Atsu turned his head and looked at him. They probably have long forgotten the meaning of these two words. He glanced at the sky and said lightly. At this moment, in front of him, there was a line of light that slowly lit up. Not far away was the edge of the snake forest. It was quiet inside and outside the forest. It looked cold and desolate. The scenery in this direction was completely different from the place where he first came out. There were many trees before, but in the southwest direction, there were many stones and hills. Further away, there was a mountain range. Lu Chen hid at the edge of the forest and secretly peeped outside for a while. There was no movement in the surroundings, but he didn't dare to be careless. His eyes were bright, and he continued to look left and right. After a while, he looked at the mountain range in the distance. He saw that the mountain was tall, but the shape of the mountain range was a little strange. It was shaped like a giant rat. From afar, the mountain was rugged and had many cracks. Only a few places had green trees. Most of the mountains were barren and cracked. Lu Chen's heart moved. He thought about a mountain that he had heard of before. It was similar to the mountain in front of him. It was called Rat Hill. The Rat Mountain was an extremely dangerous place. The most frightening thing about it was that the Cloud Earth Rat, a demonic beast unique to this place, lived in the mountain. Its body was as big as a domestic dog, and it had sharp teeth and crimson eyes. It often lived in groups in the huge underground crevices of the Rat Mountain, and its temperament was exceptionally cruel and bloodthirsty. However, after crossing Rat Hill and heading south, there was another place called Evil Python Valley. Although it was called a valley, it was actually a precipitous cliff. The cliff was steep and vertical, as if it had been carved out by a god's axe. There were many poisonous snakes in the Evil Python Valley, especially a kind of scarlet python. It was also one of the most powerful demon beasts in the outer regions of the Chaotic Lands. Over the years, it had taken the lives of countless cultivators. The Rat Mountain and the Evil Python Valley were practically connected and were both extremely dangerous places. However, as long as they crossed over these two mountains and headed south, they would almost reach the boundary between the central and outer regions of the Chaotic Lands, the River Dragon River. The world was big. Even in such a chaotic and vast land like the Chaotic Lands, Lu Chen always felt like he had no place to stand. This kind of feeling was very bad. It made people very nervous and easily angered. However, in order to survive, perhaps he could only continue to flee like this. Whether it was the devil cult or Fuyunji, their sphere of influence could only extend as far as the north bank of the Dragon River. Any further into the Chaotic Lands was no longer a place that they could control. If he wanted to survive, he could only go to the Dragon River. Lu Chen took a deep breath and walked out of the snake forest. Chapter 264. The area of this snake forest was not small. The group of black-clothed men that appeared before was about a dozen in number. Of course, it was impossible for them to really seal off this part of the forest to the point where it was airtight. Previously, they were able to block Lu Chen's path mostly because of the Requiem talisman. But this time, after Lu Chen came out of the snake forest, he did not see any black-clothed men in the vicinity. Of course, this was a kind of luck. Obviously, because they had lost the guidance of the Requiem talisman, those black-clothed men were forced to separate. And even if one person guarded a section, it was unlikely that they could completely guard all the loopholes. Without any hesitation, Lu Chen called Atsu over and sat on its back. Then he lowered his body and lay on its back. He whispered, "Run for your life." The giant black wolf's spirit was lifted. It stepped forward and began to run. Its speed increased rapidly. In the blink of an eye, it rushed forward like an arrow leaving the bow. At the same time, the wolf raised its head and seemed to be a little excited. When it opened its mouth and was about to howl, it suddenly heard Lu Chen's faint voice. "Oh yes, don't howl. If you alarm others, we'll be finished." Atu staggered and forcefully swallowed the long roar he was about to make, and then sprinted away. However, good things did not last long. Even though Lu Chen had tried to hide his figure as low as possible, people still noticed the movement here. Suddenly, whistling sounds and exclamations rose and fell. There were light figures in the sky and on the ground rushing in this direction. Lu Chen's expression did not change. He only looked back and then hugged Atsu's neck tightly. He said, "Let's run. If we are caught, we'll die." Atu no longer concealed his tracks. He suddenly let out a long howl, and his speed doubled once more. In the blink of an eye, he had actually increased the distance between him and those cultivators who had cultivated to a higher level. Exclamations of bewilderment could be heard from the group of pursuers behind them. They seemed to be surprised by Atsu's powerful legs and strength. Even Lu Chen was a little surprised. Compared to the pursuers, he was lying directly on Atsu's back. He could clearly feel the explosive power contained in Atsu's bulging muscles under its black fur. It was far more powerful than he had imagined. For a moment, a spectacular scene of a chase took place in the land of chaos. Black Wolf Atsu carried Lu Chen on his back as he ran for his life. Behind him were 5 or 6 black-robed men who were chasing after him. As time passed, more black-robed men came from other directions in the snake-overgrown forest. They gradually gathered together and charged at Lu Chen. Generally speaking, there were only 2 kinds of demonic beasts in the world when they ran at full speed. One was fast and the other was slow. Those who were slow would naturally be caught and killed. Those who were fast were extremely fast, almost faster than any cultivator who could fly in the sky. However, they generally could not last long. After all, the body of a monster beast could only withstand this kind of explosive power for a very short period of time. Therefore, in the past, whenever a human cultivator encountered a demonic beast that could run extremely fast, as long as they could keep up and hold on for a while, they would usually be able to catch it. On this day, the black-robed men following behind Atu and Lu Chen were thinking the same thing. The giant black wolf in front of them was extremely fast. Even when they were flying on their swords, they could not immediately close the distance between them. However, none of them cared about this. Everyone was chasing from afar. In any case, the demonic beast would definitely run out of energy and slow down after a short while. When that time came, wouldn't it be easy to catch it? However, as they chased after it, a short while passed, a moment passed, half an hour, and so on passed by. The black wolf in front of them became a black dot and ran further and further away. Those who were flying on their swords in the air and those who were running on the ground all fell to the ground. They were all panting and looking at each other. After a while, they all panted and cursed loudly, "Damn it! What the hell is this monster?" The strong wind blew Atsu's fur and Lu Chen's clothes. This feeling lasted for a very long time until they could no longer see the shadows of those black-robed men. Not far ahead was the rat hill that Lu Chen had seen before. Lu Chen patted the head of Atsu who was running. Only then did Atsu slow down and stop. Then, it opened its mouth and stuck out half of its tongue, panting. Lu Chen climbed down from the back of this giant black wolf and looked at it for a long time. His eyes were a little dazed. After a while, he sighed and said, "Originally, when I saw you fighting, I thought that this stupid dog was really useless. Even if you become a holy beast, you would still be like this. Who would have thought that you are so bad at fighting that you put all your abilities and strengths into running for your life?" The giant black wolf barked again, making a sound that did not match its size. Lu Chen shook his head and reached out to touch Atsu's huge head. He sighed and said, "The best holy beast in the world at running for its life. Alright, at least it has an unparalleled ability." Atsu raised its head and howled to the sky. Its howl was long and sounded very imposing, as if it was the king of all beasts. Its domineering aura shook all directions. It did not seem like it was just running for its life with Lu Chen. Rat Hill was right in front of them, and there were killers chasing after them. When they looked back to the north, the world was vast and endless. but there was no way back. Lu Chen stared at the north in silence. After letting Atsu rest for a while, he turned around and led it into Rat Hill. Rat Hill was a mountain range that was mostly desolate. Many huge and bottomless cracks could be seen all over the mountain. They were deep and dark, leading to unknown places. Legend had it that the infamous demonic beast Cloud Rat lived in these cracks. Lu Chen had heard of the Cloud Rat, but he had never seen one before. After all, if it was not necessary, no one would want to meet these cruel and bloodthirsty demonic beasts. Especially demonic beasts like the Cloud Rat, which usually moved in groups. Once they were alarmed, they would swarm in groups of hundreds or even more. Just the thought of it was enough to frighten anyone. If he had a choice, Lu Chen did not want to go through Rat Hill. But the killers chasing after him were very urgent, and no one knew if there would be new killers popping out of nowhere, such as the demonic cult, which had a deep hatred for him. So after thinking about it, it seemed that no matter how fierce a demonic beast was, it was still better than a human. So, it was better to go this way. As long as he passed through Rat Hill and the evil Python Valley, he would reach Longshuan. After crossing the legendary dangerous river, he would probably be able to shake off his pursuers. That is, if he could still survive at that time. The road on Rat Hill was surprisingly not too difficult. A large part of the reason was that the mountain was not steep or precipitous, and the terrain was relatively flat. In terms of the shape of the mountain, except for the places where the cracks cut off, most of the roads could be safely crossed. Lu Chen and Atsu carefully walked on the mountain, trying their best to avoid the big cracks and leaping over the small ones. After walking like this for half a day, nothing happened. The legendary Cloud Rat was nowhere to be seen. The huge cracks were eerie and silent, without the slightest sign of movement. This situation was somewhat out of Lu Chen's expectations, because the legendary Cloud Rat's ferocity was no joke. He was even prepared to run for his life with Atsu at any time, but now it seemed that there was no need for that. But of course, this was a good thing, not a bad thing. The sudden disappearance of the Cloud Rats made Lu Chen's expected thorny and dangerous road suddenly smooth. Lu Chen even let Atsu rest and recover his strength, then rode on Atsu's back and let him run the rest of the way. In any case, as long as there were no demonic beasts like the Cloud Rats on the mountain, it was really easy to walk. They just had to avoid the cracks. Just like that, after running for half a day, at dusk on this day, they actually smoothly crossed the legendary mountain that was said to be extremely dangerous. Under the afterglow of the setting sun, looking back at the barren Rat Mound Mountain, Lu Chen still felt that it was unreal. He thought to himself, where did all those savage and bloodthirsty Cloud Rats go? Could it be that some strange natural disaster had happened in this desolate place and directly wiped out all those demonic beasts? Because they didn't encounter any obstacles, their journey over the Rat Mound Mountain was very smooth, so their pursuers didn't catch up until now. Moreover, it would be even more difficult to find him at night. Lu Chen's heart calmed down quite a bit, and he even began to consider whether or not he should continue fleeing south. After all, the evil Python Valley, especially the Dragon Creek, was an extremely dangerous place. It would be best not to go there if he could avoid it. But this thought was quickly dispelled by the cold reality. The dangerous night of the disordered lands did not stop the murderous men in black. They were like persistent hunters who chased after them once again, crossing over the Rat Mound Mountain in the darkness of the night. Maintaining his vigilance and never letting his guard down had once again saved Lu Chen's life. One of the early warning traps that he had set up behind him had been triggered, reminding him that there was indeed no place for him to stand on this piece of land. Then he and Atsu ran for their lives like stray dogs, fleeing in panic in the dark of the night, avoiding the assassins who had blended into the darkness. That night, mournful cries could often be heard in the disordered lands. Those cries were mostly from unlucky demonic beasts who had encountered unexpected misfortune. But at the same time, Lu Chen had a strange feeling that he was being watched by a poisonous snake. A pair of icy cold eyes was staring at his back from the depths of the night. No matter how he ran, the eyes would not let go, sending a chill down his spine. He ran for an entire night and managed to shake off the men in black, but the feeling never left him. Chapter 265. Before dawn, when the sky was still gloomy and dark, Lu Chen and Atsu arrived at the outskirts of the evil Python Valley. In the dark, they couldn't see what the valley looked like. It was said that there were snakes and poisonous creatures everywhere, but the unique smell of snakes and insects in the wind indicated the danger ahead. They were still in the open area outside the evil Python Valley. If it was just the smell of ordinary snakes, it would probably be blown away by the wind. However, the smell was still so strong even though they were so far away. One could imagine how many snakes and poisonous creatures there were in the valley. Atsu was restless beside Lu Chen. This was rare. Even when they were escaping, Lu Chen didn't see Atsu have this kind of reaction. He stood beside Atsu and gently hugged its neck. Then Atsu quickly quieted down. There was a cold wind in the dark night, but the man and the dog could still feel a trace of warmth between each other. The road ahead is a bit difficult and dangerous. If it were someone else, I would think of a way to let them go. Lu Chen said with a sigh, but you are so stupid and so gullible. I really don't want to let you go. Atsu turned his head and glanced at him, his two eyes glowing with green light. Lu Chen laughed and waved his hand. Let's go, goo goo goo. Before he finished speaking, he heard a strange sound beside him. It was Atsu's stomach growling. Lu Chen froze for a moment, then realized what was going on. After a day and a night of running for their lives, Atsu wasn't a human cultivator. As a monster beast, and one that had just evolved, it was only natural that it would be hungry. For a moment, Lu Chen suddenly felt a little warm on his cheeks and eyes at the same time. Because he had been too nervous for this day and night, or perhaps because he had long been used to letting Atsu find food for himself when he was on Mount Kunlun, he had actually forgotten about this matter. And Atsu, who was supposed to be a mischievous fellow, actually followed him all the way to escape with all his might, never abandoning him, never complaining or regretting, not even a single word of complaint. Lu Chen took a deep breath in the dark and smiled. He patted Atsu's head and said softly, "Let's go find something to eat." It was not an easy task to look for food before the sun rose, especially considering that Atsu was no longer the same as before. Normal meat was no longer attractive to him. At least when Lu Chen offered him some dry rations, Atsu looked at it with disdain and almost snorted in disdain. Well, a holy beast that had evolved naturally needed to eat higher quality food. Ordinary meat was not enough, so they could only look for monsters. The most obvious place to look for monsters was the evil Python Valley. However, entering a valley full of poisonous creatures in the middle of the night was no different from seeking death. Lu Chen didn't want to go, and the half-starved Atsu didn't want to go either. It looked like it was disgusted by the fishy smell. Therefore, Lu Chen could only bring Atsu to the mountain ridge next to the evil Python Valley. He wanted to see if he could catch a few unlucky demonic beasts and feed them to this saint beast who was good at escaping. Then, when the sun rose, he would think of a way to pass through the evil Python Valley and go straight to the Dragon River. The evil Python Valley was, in fact, a valley that had suddenly sunk in the middle of a majestic mountain range that stretched for tens of thousands of miles. Although the damp and gloomy environment had bred countless poisonous insects and monsters, in terms of terrain, the evil Python Valley was actually one of the most convenient paths to the Dragon River. Of course, if it was someone at the level of the Yuanying stage, they would naturally not fear the high mountains and the strong wind that could disperse spiritual energy in the sky. They could directly fly over the top of the mountain. Although Lu Chen had a strange Taoist technique like the Black Flame, which was very powerful in actual combat, he was not good at flying. Moreover, apart from himself, there was also a huge black wolf Atsu following him. It was even more impossible for him to fly over the mountain ridge. Therefore, when he and Atsu walked up the nearest mountain ridge and looked at the mountains in front of them, they couldn't help but let out a sigh. But very soon he suddenly turned around and looked back. Behind him was the pitch-black night. Darkness was everywhere, but other than that, there seemed to be nothing and no movement. However, just now, Lu Chen clearly felt that strange, cold gaze like that of a poisonous snake again. He frowned, and after a while he turned around expressionlessly and walked up with Atsu. However, this night, they didn't seem to be very lucky. After searching for a while on the mountain ridge, they didn't encounter any unlucky monsters that ran out. On this night, it seemed that all the monsters were comfortably staying in their nests, unwilling to come out and become the supper of a certain holy beast. Atsu was a little annoyed and irritated. Lu Chen also felt a little helpless. Just as he was wondering if he should continue to search deeper into the mountain ridge, Atsu suddenly raised its head and sniffed the air a few times. Then, it turned around and called out to Lu Chen. There was a hint of joy and excitement in its voice. Then, it ran in a certain direction. Lu Chen was stunned. At this moment, they were on the mountain ridge. Because they were at a place where there was wind, the stench from the evil Python Valley could no longer be smelled. But at this moment, Atsu seemed to have suddenly discovered something. Lu Chen didn't hesitate any longer because Atsu's running speed wasn't considered slow. Moreover, they were in the middle of the night in the Bedlam land, where danger lurked everywhere. Lu Chen decided to keep up. After following Atsu for about half an hour, the sky had already begun to brighten. A trace of morning light appeared on the horizon in the distance, sprinkling over this chaotic land. It was under this morning light that when Lu Chen and Atsu ran to an open area halfway up the mountain ridge, they suddenly stopped in their tracks. This was because in front of them, in what should have been a primitive, barbaric and uninhabited mountain ridge, there was suddenly a tribe that was obviously inhabited by humans. It was in a hidden call, leaning against a towering stone wall. There were a few large caves cut into the stone wall. Apart from that, there were many very crude houses built with wood and stones outside the caves. The morning light swept across this somewhat desolate and primitive tribe. Everything was quiet, there was no smoke, and no one was moving. It seemed that everyone there was still in a deep sleep. Lu Chen's pupils constricted as he stared at the tribe. His gaze moved from the caves to the crude but tall houses, and finally landed on the center of the tribe, on a pile of triangular stones that had been piled up during the chaos. There was a black piece of wood as thick as an arm stuck into the stone pile. There were some very strange patterns carved on it. Even though they were separated by such a distance, Lu Chen could still see it clearly. He felt that it was a little familiar. But for a moment, he couldn't remember where he had seen these totem-like things before. Totem. He frowned and thought hard. He didn't know why, but he had a hunch that this thing seemed to be very important, and he must remember it. And at this moment, suddenly, Atsu beside him growled in a low voice, but it showed a trace of excitement and joy. Lu Chen turned his head and looked at Atsu. He saw that Atsu's mouth was half open, as if he was about to drool, and his pair of dog eyes were staring at a certain place in the tribe without blinking. Lu Chen immediately followed Atsu's gaze and saw that outside a few wooden houses, there was a thick rope between two big trees, and on the rope, there were 7 or 8 things that looked like cured meat hanging upside down. This stupid dog probably couldn't resist looking at the food. However, for Atsu to be so excited, it must be the meat of monsters. Thinking about it, this tribe must be quite strong to be able to catch monsters, and there seemed to be quite a number of them. As he thought about it, Lu Chen suddenly felt that the things on the rope were a little familiar. To be exact, it was very similar to something he had heard of before. It was a monster that should have been on Rat Hill Mountain, the savage and bloodthirsty cloud rats. From afar, looking at the row of cloud rats that should have been flaunting their prowess and causing headaches, but were now killed, skinned, and hung upside down like cured meat, Lu Chen couldn't help but feel an indescribable sense of strangeness. Thinking back to the unusually peaceful journey through Rat Hill Mountain, Lu Chen couldn't help but feel his heart skip a beat. Could it be that this tribe hunted rats for a living, and managed to catch almost all of the cloud rats on Rat Hill Mountain? Beside him, Atsu couldn't help but rub its head against Lu Chen's body, a questioning look in its eyes. Lu Chen hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "All right, go on then. If there's anything wrong, run back here as soon as possible." Atsu let out a cheer, then ran down the mountain towards the tribe. Lu Chen didn't follow, but stared at Atsu's figure, watching as it slowly approached the mysterious tribe. There was no one in the tribe, and there were no barriers in the surroundings, such as fences or wooden palisades, so Atsu easily slipped through. However, as it neared the tribe, Atsu clearly became more cautious, constantly looking around furtively. Then, it slowly approached the hanging meat with light footsteps. After a moment, it suddenly leapt up and bit down on a cloud rat. With a forceful tug, it immediately pulled the thing down. Atsu turned and ran, but the commotion had already alerted some of the people in the tribe. A moment later, someone ran out from the nearest house, angrily cursing at Atsu. He even threw out a stone spear. With a tut, the stone spear pierced the spot where Atsu had just run, buzzing and vibrating nonstop. In the distance, Lu Chen's body suddenly trembled. Looking at the person cursing angrily in the morning light, his face was ferocious, his mouth was filled with fangs, and his forehead was painted with many strange patterns. In an instant, Lu Chen came to a realization. This was a barbarian. This tribe was a barbarian tribe. As for the totem pattern that gave him a familiar feeling, he had indeed seen it with his own eyes. It was the same totem pattern that he saw on the face of the fire shaman 10 years ago in the Battle of the Desolate Valley. Chapter 266. The scene from 10 years ago seemed to resurface in his mind in the blink of an eye. It was so clear that it seemed like it had happened just yesterday. Every single person's appearance, movement, and expression had been frequently recalled by Lu Chen over the past few years. It was as if they had been carved into the depths of his bones and could not be forgotten. The fire shaman was an exceptionally powerful barbarian. Even in front of the 3 highly respected elders of the demon cult of the 3 realms, he did not seem to be at a disadvantage. In fact, his aura was even stronger than theirs. The source of Lu Chen's pain for the past 10 years was the fire shaman. Ever since that day, the mysterious, strange, and incomparably powerful black flame curse had entangled him unwaveringly. He could not escape it even if he died. Sometimes, during the most painful moment when the black flame burned his body, Lu Chen would vaguely see an illusion of the fire shaman's old and ferocious face. The burning flames were like the old man's terrible curse, taking revenge for the sins he had committed. Lu Chen closed his eyes and took a deep breath. When he opened his eyes again after a while, his expression had completely calmed down. He looked at the tribe of barbarians that had suddenly appeared in front of him. His eyes were completely indifferent. It had been more than 10 years since that incident. It was a long and painful period of time, but he had never regretted it. There were barbarians in the disorienting lands. As for their origin, it was because of the earth-shattering war between the human race and the barbarians thousands of years ago. The barbarians suffered a crushing defeat and retreated to the southern wasteland. However, because of the overwhelming strength of both sides, the weather changed, the mountains collapsed, and the earth cracked. Even the topography of the disorienting lands had changed. After the shocking and bloody battle, most of the barbarians retreated. However, there was still a portion of barbarians that had been cut off from the disorienting lands forever, never to return to the southern wasteland. As the victors, the human race did not show any mercy to these barbarians. Once the barbarians were discovered, they would be killed. Hence, in the end, this group of barbarians were forced to escape into the depths of the land of chaos. To be more precise, they hid in the treacherous central region of the land of chaos. Only then did they barely manage to escape the pursuit of the human race. For many years, the barbarians could hardly be seen in the outskirts of the disordered lands. Only some old barbarians who had been cruelly exiled due to their old age could be seen occasionally. For example, the barbarian that Lu Chen and Exian saw was one such barbarian. Apart from that, the fact that the barbarian tribes could only barely survive in the central region of the chaotic lands was a well-known fact that was deeply ingrained in everyone's hearts. However, the scene before him clearly told Lu Chen that things seemed to have changed. Looking at the caves on the mountain walls and the many houses made of wood and stone, it was obvious that the size of this tribe was not small. There were at least over 100 people. For such a large tribe to sneak into the outskirts of the disordered lands without anyone noticing was indeed a shocking matter. Furthermore, looking at the houses and caves of the tribe, it was obvious that this tribe had been here for a long time. Why did these barbarians suddenly head north? Even if they risked being discovered by the human race, they still chose to secretly settle down on the north bank of the Dragon River. Lu Chen did not know the reason behind this, but he guessed that the central region on the south bank of the Dragon River was too dangerous. Or perhaps this small tribe could no longer withstand the many dangers there, so they decided to take this risk. Needless to say, the tribe had chosen a very clever location. In front of them was the Rat Mound Mountain, and behind them was the evil Python Valley. Both were notoriously dangerous places. Normal humans would never come here. Even if there were people who happened to pass by, they would usually walk straight down the mountain. They would not think of running into the mountain valley to investigate, so it was very difficult to discover this tribe's hiding place. Unfortunately, Lu Chen and Atu discovered the location of this secret due to a stroke of luck on this day. Atu ran back with the cloud mouse in his mouth. He had long since shaken off the barbarians behind him. From afar, the barbarians could only curse a few times, then helplessly went to clean up the mess. Passing through the rocks and trees, Atsu ran back to Lu Chen's side and placed the dead cloud rat in front of Lu Chen. It even wagged its tail at Lu Chen, looking very pleased with itself. Lu Chen smiled and patted its head, saying, "You're amazing." Atsu didn't stand on ceremony. It buried its head and began to chew away. The cloud rat was a type of demonic beast. The spiritual energy contained in its flesh was much stronger than that of ordinary wild beasts. It was just right for Atsu's current situation. It seemed to be eating with relish. As for Lu Chen, he naturally wouldn't fight with Atsu for food. He only looked at the tribe from afar, carefully observing it. As the morning sun shone down, the sky gradually brightened. More people in the tribe began to wake up. Lu Chen saw more barbarians, and he also saw that their faces were covered with strange tattoos. They looked very familiar. They seemed very similar to the tattoos on the face of the fire shaman 10 years ago. Lu Chen's face became more and more stern and cold. Atu happily finished his feast. Although the cloud mouse was much smaller than him, Atu seemed to be very satisfied with his meal. He even let out a loud burp as he walked up to Lu Chen. Of course, it wasn't because it had eaten too much meat, but because Atsu's body was absorbing the rich spiritual energy contained in the cloud rat's flesh. Lu Chen looked down at Atsu, then softly said, "Let's go, Atsu. Let's go take a look over there." As he spoke, he brought Atu along as he flashed towards the tribe. Of course, Lu Chen wasn't stupid enough to walk straight through the gate. Instead, he used the surrounding terrain and forest to circle around, slowly approaching the tribe from the back. As he got closer, he could see many things more clearly. The men and women of the tribe, and even some of the children, all had tattoos on their faces. It seemed to be some kind of tradition passed down from ancient times, or perhaps it was some kind of religious totem. Most of them were very similar. From this, it seemed that the fire shaman of the past was inextricably linked to this tribe. But as Lu Chen carefully observed, he quickly came to a somewhat surprising conclusion. This tribe didn't seem to be very strong. Not to mention the incomparably terrifying fire shaman of the past, Lu Chen didn't even see a single barbarian that was even half as powerful as that expert. He even vaguely remembered that during the Battle of the Desolate Valley, the fire shaman had brought along 7 incomparably powerful barbarian warriors. They were similarly terrifying existences that inspired awe and veneration, but he also didn't see them in this tribe. This morning, the barbarians walking around in this barbarian tribe looked like a group of slightly stronger and stronger people. But in the eyes of human cultivators, these barbarians were no different from helpless rabbits. So after a while, Lu Chen's gaze turned towards the few caves on the mountain wall in the depths of the tribe. The disorienting lands was extremely cruel and realistic. Without strength, one wouldn't be able to survive. For this tribe to be able to survive until now, they should have some sort of background. If there were any experts around, they should be in the cave. Atsu accompanied Lu Chen in the hidden forest for a while. Gradually, it became a little impatient and softly called out a few times. Lu Chen patted its head and said, "Don't worry, these barbarians can be considered as my enemies. Moreover, they are of some use to us." About an hour after dawn, under the watchful eyes of Lu Chen, the tribe suddenly changed. Everyone walked out of their wooden houses and came to the center of the tribe, surrounding the pyramid that was pierced by black wood. After a while, from the cave under the mountain wall, people started to walk out one after another. Just as Lucian expected, the barbarians that came out of the cave this time were much stronger than the barbarians that came out of the cave. Not only did the warriors look sturdier and stronger, but there was also an old priest that came out from the back of the crowd that was surrounded and protected by many strong warriors. In the system of the barbarian tribes, the shaman held a supreme position. He represented the ability to communicate with the most sacred ancient ancestors of the barbarian world, and obtain the power that had been passed down from ancient times. However, powerful individuals like the shaman were rare. They needed the right time, the right place, and the right people, as well as an especially good opportunity. Therefore, in most of the barbarian tribes in the southern continent, there were more people like the priest who were of a lower rank. People like the shaman or the priest basically occupied the leading position in the barbarian tribes. They possessed the rare wisdom of the barbarians, who were known for their brute strength. They were the backbone that guided the growth and development of the tribe. At the same time, they were also the minority of the barbarians who could master the shaman witchcraft. This kind of power, which was completely different from the cultivation world of the central continent, was extremely powerful. During the 1,000-Year War, countless people were plunged into misery and suffering. And now, Lu Chen's gaze was fixed on the old priest in the crowd. His eyes flickered. The old priest looked so old that even his fangs had fallen out. He walked with a trembling gait, as if he was a candle that had one foot in the grave. If it was according to the cruel survival rules of the barbarian tribes in the chaotic lands, this old man would have been banished from the tribe long ago and left to fend for himself. But of course, the priest was different. The strong barbarian warriors around the old man clustered around him, their eyes filled with reverence. Then, they slowly walked to the center of the tribe and stood in front of the pile of stones. After the old priest steadied himself, he began to stretch out his hands. Facing the strange black wood, he began to chant some kind of strange and sorrowful song. Along with this song, all the barbarians knelt on the ground, prostrated themselves on the ground, and kowtowed to the totem carved on the black wood. Their faces were filled with reverence and yearning. Lu Chen looked at all this indifferently, then he raised his head and looked in the direction of the mountain ridge that he had come from. He thought to himself, those righteous evil cult assassins who enforce justice on behalf of the heavens should be catching up soon. Chapter 267. An ancient and sorrowful song was drifting in the wilderness, like a lonely river of time flowing through the endless years. At the same time as the song drifted in the air, the black wooden block on top of the pile of stones suddenly lit up. In the distance, Lu Chen's pupils contracted slightly. At that moment, he clearly saw the strange pattern that was originally engraved on the black wooden block began to glow. From the very beginning, it slowly spread along the pattern until the entire wooden block was lit up. When all the patterns on the black wooden block, which was also the totem, were completely lit up, all the barbarians who were kneeling in the surroundings shouted in unison. Their voices were majestic and full of reverence, as if they were telling their ancestor about their endless worship. At this moment, a ball of flame suddenly ignited from the black wooden block and began to burn fiercely. The barbarians' shouts became louder and louder, and many of them kept kowtowing. In the distance, Lu Chen's body suddenly trembled. He only felt that his ocean of qi was churning, as if the sky and earth were spinning, and the divine wheel was reversing. He let out a muffled groan, and stretched out his right hand, subconsciously grabbing a small tree next to him. In an instant, black flames gushed out from his palm, and burned the small tree into charcoal. However, this sudden throbbing came and went very quickly. Not long after, the black flames disappeared from Lu Chen's hands and eyes, and he returned to normal. However, Lu Chen's eyes revealed a hint of shock. Then, his eyes stared at the pile of stones that was surrounded by the barbarians, and the black wooden block that was stuck upside down on top of the pile of stones. There was something strange about that black wooden block. Lu Chen made this judgment in a split second. Because for so long, Especially after he had swallowed and mastered that strange black flame, the only thing that could make the black flame in his body lose control was the unknown mysterious force in the forbidden area of Kunlun Mountain. Apart from that, it seemed like there was only the blackwood of this mysterious tribe. Of course, the difference in strength between the two could be said to be like heaven and earth. Both were caused by the resonance in Lu Chen's black fire power. However, the power in the depths of Kunlun Mountain was so powerful that it was almost impossible for a human to contend against it. On the other hand, the black fire resonance that the piece of black wood in front of him could be said to be very weak. In fact, it only took a moment for Lu Chen to regain control of the black fire in his body. This piece of black wood was actually related to the power of black fire. This discovery made Lu Chen very surprised. But when he thought that the fire shaman might have come from this tribe, everything seemed to be explainable. Lu Chen even vaguely guessed that perhaps it was his ambush in the desolate valley that killed the fire shaman. After losing such a powerful shaman, as well as the 7 abnormally powerful barbarian warriors who followed the fire shaman to the desolate valley, this tribe must have inevitably weakened. From the looks of it, he and this tribe were really fated. Of course, Lu Chen was not a soft-hearted person. He looked at the scene of the destitute barbarian tribe below. His expression did not change. His pair of eyes stared at the piece of wood most of the time, deep in thought. Then, as if he sensed something, he suddenly raised his head and looked into the distance. He saw that at the entrance of the call, there were a few sword lights flying in the sky. The forest on the ground was quiet, but occasionally a few birds would suddenly fly up in fright, flapping their wings and flying away from the forest. Lu Chen pursed his lips. After a moment of silence, he stood up and led Atsu down the dense foliage of the forest, slowly approaching the quiet tribe. Stay here and don't go out. Otherwise, your appearance will be too conspicuous. People will recognize you at a glance. Lu Chen brought Atsu along as they slowly walked through the forest. He crouched down behind a bush that was the closest to the barbarian tribe. He then instructed Atsu, "Wait for me here. When those people come in, I will also go down for a while. I should be back soon." Woof. Atsu seemed to understand Lu Chen's words, but it obviously did not agree. After lowering its voice and growling, it opened its mouth and gently bit the leg of Lu Chen's pants. It looked like it did not want him to go down and die. "Don't worry," Lu Chen patted Atsu's head and said, "I'm not as stupid as you. How could anything happen to me?" Atsu glared at him, its fangs crisscrossed, as if it was considering whether it should just bite this person to death. Lu Chen did not seem to feel anything. He hugged its neck and said to Atsu, "I have my own plan." Then, Atsu's eyes widened as it saw Lu Chen put his hand to his chest. After a while, he suddenly took out a set of black clothes. Then he slowly took off his outer clothes and put on a black outfit. At this moment, Lu Chen's appearance was almost similar to the man in black who chased after him a few days ago. When he took out a black cloth and covered his face, there was no trace of the original Lu Chen. He looked like a devil cult killer. Atsu's eyes were fixed on him. Lu Chen smiled and then said to Atsu, "Thanks to my cleverness, I still have the black clothes that I snatched from Qingshitang village. Today, it will come in handy." The strange ceremony in the barbarian tribe was very long and boring, but none of the barbarians had any complaints about it. Every one of them looked very reverent. Obviously, to the barbarians, this worship of their ancestors was the most important thing in their lives. The old shaman never stopped singing. But perhaps it was because he was too old, or because his ability was limited. In the end, his physical strength obviously could not keep up. He had to rely on the support of a few barbarian warriors beside him to continue singing. But even so, the shaman did not have the slightest intention of giving up. He never stopped singing the ancient song. Even further away, the sword gleams that were circling in the sky slowly descended. In the end, they landed almost soundlessly in a forest outside of the kernel. After a while, more than 10 figures walked out of the forest, one after another. They stood on the hillside of the mountain forest, looking at the mysterious barbarian tribe from afar. Lu Chen could even see the shock in the gazes and expressions of the people on the other side. None of the black-clothed men expected to see such a scene in the wilderness. Soon, the group of people began to talk to each other and even started to argue. Some of the men in black pointed to the distance and passed the tribe. It seemed to mean that the important matter was more important. But at the same time, there were also men in black pointing to the barbarian tribe in the call and saying something excitedly. At first, there were only 1 or 2 people in such a dispute. But soon, other people joined in. Then it quickly developed to the point that almost all the men in black joined in. They were divided into 2 groups that were almost evenly matched. The barbarians in the tribe were still focused on the strange ceremony. The men in black did not make a loud noise to disturb them. Wuxia was quietly lurking on the other side of the tribe, patiently waiting. Finally, the men in black in the forest came to a final conclusion after an intense but low-key debate. Wuxia stared at the forest. He saw the dozens of men in black slowly spread out. It was like a big net with sharp hooks with a murderous aura. It slowly surrounded the tribe. Many people took out their magical weapons in silence. The cold brilliance of the weapons glittered in the morning sun, as if they were thirstily waiting for blood to be poured on them. In the barbarian tribe, the old priest who was chanting suddenly trembled slightly. He seemed to have sensed something. He suddenly raised his head and looked at the surrounding forest. However, it was also at this moment that a flame soared into the sky. It was like a soul-chasing command talisman. In an instant, the surrounding forest around the tribe was filled with roars. The roars were like dragons and tigers, surging from all directions. Dozens of black figures rushed over at the same time. The sword light filled the sky. The trees fell and the trees were broken. The cold eyes of the god of death swept across the small kernel. The next moment, it was time for blood to splatter. Roar! A roar like that of a demon beast rang out from the crowd of barbarians. The strong warriors rushed out and greeted the men in black with their flesh and blood. But their enemies were the extremely powerful cultivators of the human race. They possessed terrifying strength and many magical techniques. Not to mention, they had the help of many magical weapons. From the beginning of the battle, there was a great disparity between the strong and the weak. At the moment of the first collision, blood splattered everywhere. At least 4 barbarian warriors were directly cut down. One of them was even brutally cut in half by the incomparably sharp immortal sword of the human race. In an instant, the barbarian tribe was filled with screams and cries. It was probably the relatives of the warriors who died in the battle. These originally strong barbarians were now like frightened sheep, frantically fleeing in all directions. Only the old priest's eyes were red. He suddenly raised both of his hands and muttered an incantation. Then, several red lights shot out from his hands and submerged into the barbarian warriors' bodies. Suddenly, the barbarian warriors roared wildly. Their bodies suddenly increased in size. They were almost like monsters. Their strength also increased by more than 2 times. They actually used this courage to temporarily block the attack of the men in black. But this strange method could not last long. Not all barbarian warriors could withstand the red light of the priest. Only 5 or 6 of the strongest barbarian warriors could. They blocked half of the men in black. But in other directions, the rest of the men in black had directly rushed into the tribe. In an instant, blood splattered everywhere. Swords were stained with hot blood. Heads fell to the ground and severed limbs flew. It was a bloody scene. The old priest seemed to be angry. He let out a loud roar and actually spat out a mouthful of blood. At the same time, in the chaos, no one noticed that Wuxia, who was dressed in black and had his face covered with a black cloth, had also quietly entered the village. Then he directly rushed towards the pile of stones. Chapter 268. More than a dozen experienced and highly skilled human cultivators charged into the barbarian tribe. They looked like a pack of tigers charging into a pen of sheep. Other than a few strong barbarian warriors who were at the forefront, who could barely resist for a while, the rest of the people, regardless of their age or gender, were no match for them. Even though the barbarians were fierce by nature, and many of them still picked up weapons, sticks, and stones to fight to the death, but in front of the incomparably sharp divine weapons, all of these were like pieces of paper, completely defenseless. In an instant, the barbarians were thrown off their feet, and blood splattered in all directions. This group of black-robed men were obviously used to seeing blood and death. Once they made a decision to attack, they did not show any mercy in the face of such a tragic situation. They could be said to have a heart of stone. For a moment, the tribe was filled with cries and screams of pain. There was a continuous stream of people lying in pools of blood, twitching as they died. Fresh blood and broken limbs could be seen everywhere. Lu Chen was already in the village of this tribe. When he saw this scene, his footsteps paused for a moment. He did not have a good impression of the barbarians. To be exact, he and the majority of the human race hated this race. Before the 1,000-Year War, the barbarians had invaded the Central Plains. The people were plunged into misery and suffering, and countless civilians died tragically. Moreover, the barbarians were savage by nature, and some tribes were so terrible that they even committed cannibalistic acts. Therefore, this was also the reason why until today, when the human cultivators discovered the remnants of the barbarians in the land of chaos, they would always kill them. Today's situation was obviously a conventional way for the black-robed men to kill the barbarians. The blood feud that had lasted for thousands of years could no longer be resolved. However, this barbarian tribe did not only consist of warriors, there were also the elderly, the weak, women, and children. This massacre obviously did not differentiate between them. Looking at the scene of the barbarians falling one after another, Lu Chen suddenly felt a little uncomfortable in his heart. Was his heart softening? Lu Chen shook his head slightly to get rid of these messy thoughts. Just as he was about to continue moving forward, a small figure suddenly staggered from the side. It was a barbarian boy. Half of his face was stained with blood, but he didn't know if it was his own or someone else's blood that had splattered onto his face. Looking from the direction he was running from, there was a swift and fierce black-clothed man wielding a weapon as he slaughtered. The boy seemed to have suffered quite a bit of shock and was running crazily to the other side. However, from the corner of his eye, Lu Chen saw that in the other direction he was running to, there was a black-clothed man killing his way over. Running over there seemed to be suicidal. When the barbarian kid ran past Lu Chen hesitated for a moment, but he still extended his hand and grabbed the boy. The barbarian kid screamed and turned his head to look at Lu Chen. The sharp fangs in his mouth were bared in anger, and he struggled with all his might. Lu Chen frowned, but he was too lazy to argue with him. He pushed the boy to the ground, and at the same time he pointed at the path that he had just come in from without batting an eyelid. There were no black-clothed men in that direction, so it was a way to escape. Immediately after, Lu Chen continued to walk forward. After all, his goal was not to save people, but to take advantage of the chaos to steal the mysterious black piece of wood that could actually resonate with the black fire in his body. However, he had only walked a few steps when he suddenly heard a gust of wind behind him. Lu Chen frowned and turned around to look. He saw that the boy had a terrified expression on his face and was running towards him. He suddenly jumped up and threw himself into Lu Chen's arms. Was it because he was too frightened? So when he saw someone showing kindness, he felt that it was a shelter that he could rely on? Lu Chen looked at the boy and reached out to catch him. However, after a moment, his expression suddenly changed. His right hand suddenly reached down and grabbed the hand of the barbarian kid. The sharp edge of a small knife had already pierced through the clothes on his lower abdomen and was just about to reach his skin. The barbarian kid screamed crazily and desperately tried to stab the sharp knife into Lu Chen's stomach. However, Lu Chen's hand was like iron to him, and it did not move at all. Lu Chen grabbed the barbarian kid, and his eyes had already turned cold. After a moment, he suddenly said, "When others kill people and bleed, you are so scared that you don't dare to fight back and run around. I saw that you are pitiful, so I saved you and helped you, but you want to kill me?" The barbarian kid let out a beast-like roar. It was unknown whether he understood Lu Chen's words, but his face was full of viciousness. He gritted his teeth and desperately tried to push the knife in his hand to stab Lu Chen to death. After trying for a while, But to no avail, he suddenly opened his mouth and bit down on Lu Chen's right wrist. At the same time, the strength in his hand increased greatly. It was obvious that he wanted to use this opportunity to get away from Lu Chen and then stab into Lu Chen's lower abdomen. Lu Chen swung his hand, and the barbarian kid flew up involuntarily. Then, before he could recover, he felt that his neck had been grabbed by someone. At this time, the barbarian kid suddenly felt his vision darken. He saw that in addition to Lu Chen, there was also a black figure that suddenly appeared behind Lu Chen. It was another black-clothed man, and no one knew when he had stood behind Lu Chen. He glanced at the barbarian kid and said in a deep voice, "What's wrong?" Lu Chen's body stiffened. Just when he was about to move, the barbarian kid in front of him suddenly struggled. A trace of viciousness flashed in his eyes, and he pointed at the escape route that Lu Chen had pointed out to him. He opened his mouth and was about to speak loudly. Lu Chen's pupils suddenly shrank, and a cold intent flashed in his eyes. In that split second, he suddenly shook his hand. The barbarian kid's face suddenly stiffened, and all the words that he wanted to say were suddenly stuck in his throat, and he could no longer speak. A crisp sound of bones breaking rang out from his neck. There was a look of disbelief in his eyes, and he looked at Lu Chen, whose eyes had suddenly become cold. He didn't think that this soft-hearted person would suddenly become so cold and merciless. Then, his head slowly drooped down, and there was no more sound. Lu Chen slowly stood up, and turned around to look at the black-clothed man behind him. The black-clothed man nodded and said, "Well done." After that, he left the place and flew into the distance. Lu Chen looked at the black-clothed man as he left, and then looked at the barbarian kid who had already fallen on the ground. His eyes were indifferent. After a while, he turned around and also left the place. The battle in the barbarian village was getting more and more intense, but in reality, they weren't evenly matched. To be exact, from the beginning, the barbarian tribe had basically fallen into a terrible situation. The strength of the black-clothed men who had suddenly appeared was too strong, and their methods were too cruel. They didn't give the barbarian tribe any chance. The situation in the village was tragic and bloody. Not long after, dozens of barbarians had already fallen, and the black-clothed men who had invaded were not even injured, let alone dead. The difference in strength between the two sides was too big, and the scene was chaotic. Under the cover of this chaos, Lu Chen approached the pile of stones without anyone noticing. The strange black piece of wood was inserted on top of the pile of stones, and it was about 5 or 6 feet high. Lu Chen's eyes swept over it and suddenly froze. He stopped at a certain place below the pile of stones for a moment. Somewhere in the pile of stones, there were a few white things. Lu Chen's eyes instantly became cold, and his eyes were full of killing intent. The white things were the color of bones, and there were a few round things in the pile of stones. They looked like human skulls, and the black holes of the skulls looked gloomy and terrifying. But what was more frightening was that Lu Chen could clearly see some broken bite marks on 1 or 2 of the bones, as if they had been gnawed on by wild beasts. His body suddenly trembled, and even his breathing became hurried. After a while, he forced himself to look away and clenched his teeth. He controlled his mind and took a deep breath, and then walked towards the black piece of wood. But right in front of his eyes, a hand suddenly reached out from the side and snatched the black piece of wood away in an instant. Lu Chen was shocked. He looked up and saw that it was the old barbarian priest. His old face was filled with madness, and he grabbed the black piece of wood and leaned it against his body. Suddenly, the totem symbols on the black piece of wood that had dimmed after the ceremony was interrupted suddenly lit up, and a strange aura emitted from the black piece of wood. The old barbarian priest's eyes were bloodshot, and he shouted a few incomprehensible words from his mouth. It seemed like he was chanting something like an incantation. Strands of red aura floated up from the black piece of wood, and immediately rushed towards the barbarians who were still alive in the surroundings. The scene was as if there were hundreds of red lines suddenly connecting all the barbarians to the black piece of wood in a way that would make one's scalp tingle. Every red line was tied to the head of a barbarian, and then, following the old priest's hoarse howl, a strange change occurred. All the barbarians, regardless of whether they were old or young, had their bodies inflated like a balloon. Their faces were ferocious, and their eyes were bulging out. Their ugly faces now looked like those of evil spirits. But at the same time, the strength of these barbarians seemed to have doubled, especially the strongest of the barbarians. Their bodies had doubled in size, and in a short period of time, they seemed to be suppressing the black-robed men who were charging towards them. Such a strange secret technique was unbelievable. But soon, everyone realized that this secret technique wasn't a very comfortable thing to do. Because suddenly, someone let out a blood-curdling scream in front of everyone's eyes. A barbarian woman's swollen body exploded and instantly turned into powder. Blood flowed like a river. But even more barbarians seemed to have gone mad and rushed towards the black-robed men. An even more horrifying battle had begun. Chapter 269. The situation of the battle became more and more tragic. Flesh and blood flew everywhere in the village. It had completely turned into a hellish place. The black-robed men who had the upper hand suddenly suffered a setback. In this sudden counterattack, the barbarian villagers who had suddenly turned crazy and violent gave them an unexpected blow. Caught off guard, these black-robed men retreated again and again. Some of them were even wounded. This scene was obviously out of everyone's expectation. A series of angry roars sounded from the black-robed men everywhere. The situation became a little chaotic. However, these black-robed men were not a motley crew after all. Apart from their valiant combat strength, there were also some who had sharp eyes and sharp eyes. Soon, someone saw the key point and shouted, "It's that old man! Quickly kill that old thing!" As soon as the shout came out, the black-robed men immediately came to their senses. For a moment, their swords shone brightly, and sharp whistling sounds were heard. They all wanted to kill the old priest. At this moment, the old priest was still standing beside the pile of rocks. His eyes were bloodshot, and even his pupils were covered to the point that they could not be seen. A few drops of dark red blood flowed down from the corner of his eyes. It looked extremely strange and especially mournful. The black piece of wood on his chest was still emitting countless red lines, connecting all the barbarians in the village. Under the urging of the mysterious incantation, the barbarians roared like wild beasts and madly pounced towards the black-robed men. Wuxia was the one who was originally the closest to the pile of stones. When he saw that the strange black piece of wood was within his reach, it was suddenly snatched away by the old priest. Then this horrifying scene happened. Almost without giving him any chance to react, Wuxia suddenly found that he had suddenly fallen into a tight encirclement. There were barbarians almost everywhere around him. And at this moment, those barbarians who had already fallen into madness, regardless of gender or age, were all pouncing towards him. Wuxia felt a pressure as heavy as a mountain. It was as if he had fallen into the illusion of a group of demonic beasts. He made a prompt decision and immediately turned to run. These barbarians seemed to be slightly stronger than ordinary human beings, but they were still much weaker than human cultivators. However, it was unknown what strange technique the old shaman had used through the black totem. In just a split second, the red thread had caused the bodies of these barbarians to explode. They had become so powerful that they could fight against the cultivators. Fortunately, Wuxia was agile, and these barbarians hadn't completely adapted to the sudden increase in strength. Although they were fierce and unafraid of death, they weren't very agile when it came to advancing and retreating. Therefore, after a while, Wuxia was really lucky enough to escape from the barbarians. After running back to the forest, Wuxia looked back and saw that the barbarians did not chase after him. At most, they chased him to the edge of the village, and then they turned back and rushed towards the remaining black-robed men. Wuxia panted for a while. Suddenly, there was a rustling sound in the forest next to him. He was shocked and took a step back. After a while, the leaves of the forest were pushed aside, and it was Atsu who jumped out. Wuxia breathed a sigh of relief and nodded to Atsu. Atsu looked at him with some worry in his eyes. He looked at Wuxia, then looked at the chaotic and bloody village at the foot of the mountain, and let out a low roar. Wuxia also frowned. He stood next to Atsu and looked down. Then, he said softly, "The situation doesn't seem right, it's too strange." At this moment, the situation in the barbarian village was indeed getting more and more strange. The barbarians seemed to have gone completely crazy. They rushed forward and fought with the black-robed men. They bit, kicked, and smashed them. They did everything they could. Even if they were injured by the black-robed men's weapons, or had their fingers or arms chopped off, these barbarians did not seem to feel any pain. They still roared and rushed towards their enemies. The black-robed men who wanted to rush and kill the old priest found that they were not only blocked by these crazy barbarians, but were also gradually forced to retreat. They were getting further and further away from the old priest. This was originally a one-sided battle, but the barbarians had turned the tables. The scales of victory and defeat were about to be reversed. But right at this moment, someone suddenly sneered from within the crowd, and then someone suddenly flew up and flashed into midair. After a long howl, sword light rose explosively, and it shockingly transformed into a myriad of azure sword lights that slashed down with an imposing manner. In an instant, there was a loud bang on the ground. 3 or 4 barbarians bore the brunt of the attack and fell to the ground. Blood sprayed out like a fountain. It was Qianji Xianqing's sword. In the air, the black-robed man shouted in a deep voice, "Gather!" His voice was like the sound of thunder rumbling out. After a moment, all the black-robed men simultaneously gathered towards his side. Along the way, they supported each other. 1 merged into 2, 2 merged into 3. The black-robed men quickly changed from their original scattered state to a situation where they gathered together. At the same time, as the black-robed man in the air continued to shout out orders, the black-robed men stood in their respective positions and quickly formed a battle formation. With this, the situation immediately changed. The black-robed men quickly stabilized their footing. Under the battle formation, they no longer had to worry about the threat behind them. They focused on the outside and soon blocked those crazy barbarians. In the distance, Lu Qin, who was standing on the mountainside and watching from afar, his face tightened. His eyes revealed a somewhat dignified look. He said in a low voice, "Powerful." Atsu raised his head and looked at him. He seemed to be somewhat puzzled. In this battle of life and death, the black-robed assassins of the human race were originally the party with the highest cultivation. They had an overwhelming advantage over the barbarians. Although no one knew what kind of strange magic the old shaman had used during this period of time and caused the battle to reverse, but after the black-robed men formed their formation, once they stabilized their footing, the situation immediately became clear. No matter how ferocious and crazy the barbarians were, and how fearless they were, they could not force the black-robed men to take a step back. Instead, under the various kinds of sharp sword lights, blood flowed like a tide. One by one, the barbarians began to fall to the ground and die. The situation, in the end, did not deviate from the normal range. The strange magic of these barbarians, in the end, did not go against the natural order. The old shaman held the black wooden block in his arms. His face was ferocious, and his eyes were bleeding. But a trace of despair and sorrow finally appeared on his face. He suddenly let out a desolate roar, as if with the last of his life force. A mouthful of blood sprayed from his mouth and directly onto the black wooden block. The dark totem suddenly shone brightly, and a strong and strange force descended from the sky, crashing down and shrouding the village. On the mountainside, Lu Chen's body suddenly shook. He staggered and fell to the ground. From his body, at this moment, black flames suddenly burst out and directly turned him into a flaming man. You're tuning in to the Han Li's Immortal Journey YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.